Welcome back to Why Blank Lost, or as we call it this time every season, Why Blank Won.
That's right.
I'm David Bloomberg, and with me, of course, as she has been the whole Survivor 44 journey, is my co-host, Jessica Lewis.
That's right. I'm here, and as you can see, I'm rocking the David, you're right side of my sweatshirt because you were right, and yes, David was right. Now my house is going to be a mess.
For those only listening, you can tune into the video to see Jessica shooting silly string all over the place. Yes.
It's all over my ceiling.
Oh, that's going to be fun.
But yes, you were right. And I'm very happy that you were right. I can't give you a hard time. I mean, Jam Jam is a fantastic winner. I think everyone who we were able to watch in this final episode were fantastic, would have been fantastic winners, but we must celebrate David in this moment because he was right. Uh-oh.
That was the original David, you're right.
So much silly string all around my house.
That was the original.
Yes.
Yes, I mentioned that we call this episode Why Blank Won, as you can see on my shirt. We could also call it David, you're right, as we see on your shirt. We could also call it, Why Jam Jam Won.
That's true. And this is about Jam Jam. It's not just about David. It's more about Jam Jam.
It's not just about David.
So thank you, Jam Jam, for giving us an opportunity to also celebrate David.
Yes. And not only did I predict him preseason, I predicted him last episode, and I even got the 5th and 4th place results right, too.
Well, listen, of course you're going to stick with your winner pick. Why would you do that at the last minute?
Last season, I didn't.
Oh, all right. We're revisiting. Okay, well. Oh, I didn't get any silly string in my water, so that's good.
Oh, that's good. That's
fabulous.
Yeah, I think
silly string all over.
I think the finale was another good episode, and despite the overabundance of twists and advantages and idols early on, I'd say it was a good season overall. I agree with Rob that it's the best of the new era.
Yes, I really do think that the players were able to find a nice balance amongst all of the things that production likes to add. I feel like we saw more of the players utilizing social capital as opposed to utilizing trinkets and things. They did play with them, and I think they were very smart in the way in which they executed the use of them. But I really feel like we got to see actual relationship building, and that is what I think really carried these players in particular to the end.
Yes. And we're not just saying that because I was right about my winner prediction.
No. Listen, I'll give you props. I will. But Jam Jam, you killed it. You just killed it. Yeah.
Yeah. The cast was amazing, and production should be applauded for that. Yes. And they let them play without much BS in the later half of the season.
Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, but we are, as you said, not necessarily here to discuss how I was right. We're actually here to discuss why Jam Jam won and Heidi, Carolyn, Carson, and Lauren lost. To do that, we will compare all of their games, all of them in one podcast.
Get ready.
To my rules for winning that I originally wrote way back after season 1, have been updating ever since. I would say using all the non-spoiler information, but who cares if it's spoiled now? Right. Although I don't necessarily think we have any spoiler information other than, hey, psst, Jam Jam won.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. But, from what we got on TV, interviews, social media, and secret scenes. And I do mean all season. We have notes going back to episode 1 that are going to come into play in these discussions. For anyone who wants to catch up on the rules now, just to see the last view of the Survivor 44 version, you can go to robhaswebsite.com/yxlostfeed and click on the link bubble for the Survivor 44 rules.
That's right.
Now, one thing I want to remind everyone before we get started is we have to talk about 5 players, 2 of whom were purpled, 1 severely so. And so we can't, we unfortunately can't give them all the time they deserve and would otherwise have gotten on a podcast fully devoted to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, on the plus side, they didn't get a whole podcast fully devoted to them because they didn't lose earlier.
Fair. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but before we go any further, since this is going to be a long podcast, I want to remind everyone that in just a relatively few days, we will once again be getting together with Tiffany Seeley and Dr. David Voce for a special postseason wrap-up. And considering what Voce told us earlier in the season about Carolyn, just imagine what he can say now.
Yes, and considering what the text message exchanges have been amongst the four of us, it's going to be feisty. So get ready, everyone. I'm telling you right
Someone
now.
may get voted out beforehand.
It might just happen. It might just happen. There was even a threat to go to Rocks, which, thank you, Voce, for that one.
Yeah.
But yes.
I might have been the one who said that one. But yes. Did you get
really? You did that?
It might have been Voce. I'll just blame Voce. You can't check.
Oh gosh,
it was definitely Voce.
It's just the Davids.
Yes,
that's it. It's the Davids.
Yeah. So everyone should get their questions in for any or all of the four of us now, and you could do that on Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Just send them our way.
Yep.
Now, besides that, before we get to the rules, we usually have some other things to discuss from this week's episode. Because we have so much to talk about, and it was the finale, we'll keep this part short. In fact, the only thing I really have is to close out the season. Jeff Probst, unfortunately, didn't disappoint and gave us several things for our Jeff Probst is wrong about blank segment. At the beginning of the episode, and then again after Jam Jam won, Jeff kept emphasizing big moves and risky moves and full tilt boogie and all that crap, suggesting that it played into the season in a positive way when that had literally nothing to do with Jam Jam's game.
Yeah.
In fact, it was the opposite. Spoiler alert to why Jam Jam won. It wasn't because of full tilt boogie. You know, he even said, Jam Jam did, in one tribal council that he used smoke and mirrors and that it was smart to hide how great a player he was. Hearing Jeff talk about it this way is like watching a baseball game that was won 3-0. And then in the post game, the announcer talks about all the grand slams. It literally makes no sense.
Yeah. Well, I really feel like that's Jeff's idea of what Survivor should be. And so I feel like if he keeps emphasizing it, then that's what listeners will take away from it. And then listeners who apply, maybe play that way.
Yeah, but it's like gaslighting us. At the end,
I know.
We literally saw Jam Jam win, playing a certain way that was the opposite of this. And then Jeff turns to the cameras and says, they played full tilt boogie and they did this and they did that. And it's like, some did, and they were voted out.
Well, and I think maybe because in part of his conversation with Jam Jam, just about how he tells players, if you're the first time you play, you should play like it's the second time you're playing. He did talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
And perhaps it's not necessarily the big move-itis that he's emphasizing, but just more of the willing to take risks and willing to put yourself out there, which doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a big move. Sometimes people do go out there to play this game and they kind of shrink a little bit and they're hesitant to do things. And maybe that's what he was emphasizing with Jam Jam, that Jam Jam took the risks he needed to do and was willing to push and was willing to do things that might have been uncomfortable because he knew that he had to. And so that's, again, not a big move, but it is putting yourself in a position where you might not want to be, but understanding you need to in order to further your game.
Yeah, but the type of risks that Jam Jam took are more the type that Heidi described, the calculated risks. When you need to, not the Danny type of moves.
And for sure. And so I think maybe that's what Jeff is looking at is that there are those moments.
You're being more charitable to Jeff than I am.
I am being charitable because I can kind of understand, that there are things that even when I sit and think about the game that I played, boy, I wish I had done that, or it would have been great if I had thought about that. And so I think Jeff doesn't want people to walk away doing that. He wants them to say, you know what, if I think about it and I want to do it, I should do it. But I think what we did see with both Heidi and Jam Jam, who both talked about it, what they did was calculated. There was a reason for it. Where someone like Danny, who was like, I just want to make a big move to make a big move, that's different. That's
Right.
completely different. Big moves can also be calculated, but they can also just be big moves. And I think that's where the breakdown has to occur. Like, what is the actual calculated reason for this? And is it worth the risk? And that can come in small little nuggets, and it can also come in something much grander, like playing an idol or things to that, in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, then on Jeff's podcast, and you brought up his podcast a little already, it was mostly interviews with the final three. But he started by talking about those who say you should never win a reward challenge, which, by the way, tells me he does listen to or read at least some media, even if he pretends not to. He and his co-hosts, of course, disagreed with the idea that you shouldn't win a reward challenge because, heaven forbid, a player should put strategy over a big TV moment. But okay, there could be disagreements about that, even if they're wrong. But worse than that, he applied it specifically to Carson's Final Five challenge win, which was for immunity.
Yeah, and then that was an added bonus. You get to eat too.
The reward was the added bonus, but Jeff and Brittany on the podcast made it sound like it was just a reward challenge. And that some people would say he shouldn't have won. No, nobody in their right mind would say that Carson should not have won that immunity challenge.
Yeah.
I don't know what the heck Jeff was smoking, and Brittany right along with him on that podcast when they were doing it.
Yeah. No, that's definitely one that you want to win for sure, because it's immunity.
Yeah.
But yes, when the reward challenges are connected to it and then you have to choose someone, that's where it obviously gets very sticky.
It's sticky, but the part that he wanted was the winning immunity part.
Right. Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, and it's
especially in that
this is what I want to say this too, just real quick, is in regards to that circumstance. How many times has Jeff said, and you get to choose someone to go on the reward with you, and they pick, and then he's like, you get to pick one more person. It's like you never actually know, like, what is the final.
No, but this time he did.
Be?
He said you get to pick one and only one.
Right. It was very specific this time. It wasn't like there was a chance that he was going to be able to pick two, which I thought was an interesting dynamic, because normally there's this like, could there be another one?
Right. Normally he leaves it up in the air. And yeah, it was just strange that he didn't this time.
Right. Yeah. This time it was like, nope, just one.
Yeah. Which I actually think is more dramatic, because if he had said you can pick one and he picked someone and then that was it, Carson could have said, I was sure he was going to let me pick two. But in this case, because he said this, Carson couldn't use that excuse if it had come up, which it didn't, as far as we saw.
Sure.
All right. Well, I have many other thoughts, and I have already started putting those out in TikToks and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So you can check those out at, at David Bloomberg TV on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. And I'll probably be putting out these videos longer than most people care about seeing them. But hey, there's lots to say.
That show's done. It's over. Moving on, right?
Yeah.
Not Bloomberg.
Yeah. Nope. I've got slots to fill in there. Now, was there anything else you wanted to cover before the rules?
Well, I think we're going to be covering a significant amount of any potential complaints I might have or issues with the episode as we move forward. So I think we should probably just get into it, considering we have so much to discuss.
Okay. Well, before we do that, we just, of course, need to mention that the rules we're about to discuss come in a shorter and much more colorful version.
Yes, they do.
In poster form at robhasawebsite.com/yxlostfeed. Scroll down, click on. You could do multiple clicks, I guess, on the poster.
Sure.
And, buy it. The shipping department will get it to you. You will love it. And you could be like Carolyn and live it.
That's right. Every time I heard her talking about, don't be emotional.
Yeah.
I always thought
be logical. And then also, if you want to just have them with you at all times, you can get the poster on a t-shirt, or you can get the checklist on a t-shirt, which of course I'm wearing backwards right now.
Yes, which we should know. We are both wearing our shirts backwards today.
Yeah, and it's not like it's backwards day or something. Like this is not some protest against who won. It's just that Well, the
It's
Y
the
blank one is
messaging.
on the
The
back. Yes,
messaging needed to be
the
expressed.
messaging.
My
Exactly.
son did ask. He's like, "Mom, do you have a shirt that says David is right?" And I'm like, "Actually, I do."
Yeah.
So,
Right.
yes.
I
So,
like it that your son is even thinking about it.
he is. He was definitely thinking about it.
All
Yes.
right. You are bringing him up right. Uh,
I'm trying. I'm
yeah.
doing what I can. He was also very excited about the silly string, so I think he'll probably appreciate
Yeah.
utilizing these when I'm done.
Till you tell him he has to clean it up, right?
Oh my gosh, I can't believe it's all over my ceiling. Well, we'll get to it.
Yeah, yeah. Not on the podcast. You can make
No.
a separate video of you, like for TikTok or Instagram of you
Oh my
cleaning it
gosh,
off the
you and your
ceiling.
TikToks.
Yes.
This is I have a pile right now. I collected a little bit, but yeah, we'll be good.
Oh, I
We'll
thought
get
you
to
meant
it.
of TikToks. I'm like, how did you collect a pile of TikToks?
No,
Oh, you meant of silly string.
silly
Okay.
string.
All right. All right. Well, the Tika 3 secretly controlled almost the entire pre-merge game of Survivor 44, and all of them managed to make it the finale, as did Heidi and Lauren, of course. But only one could win, and two would be knocked out without a chance to present themselves to the jury. Why did Lauren immediately follow her Ratu compatriot, Jamie? How did Carson go from being everybody's beloved to a juror in little more than 3 minutes? And what happened among those final three to result in that last vote for $1 million? It's finally time to determine why Jam Jam won and Heidi, Carolyn, Carson, and Lauren lost. Buckle in. We begin with the first and most important rule, scheme and plot. Jam Jam said, "My words are my weapons." And that's a big part of this rule, using your words to get people to do what you want them to do. Obviously, the brain is a big part too in planning things out, and Jam Jam showed his abilities there as well. But he knew convincing people to do things that will end up being in your best interest is the key. He even said in the preseason, "I love strategy. I love manipulation." And that was one thing that made me love him from the beginning. And did I mention make him my winner prediction?
Yes, you did mention that he was your winner pick. I might have mentioned it a few times too.
Yeah. Even better, he carried through on what he said before the game, starting from the very first Tika vote when Sarah and Helen thought he was with them, but he had already made an alliance with Carson and Carolyn. And then it just kept going from there.
Yeah, he was so impressive in his ability to fully appreciate what each person could provide to him. And he did that by really one-on-ones with everyone and really trying to delve into how they were playing the game. But he did it in a way that didn't come across as threatening or it didn't come across as like schemy. He was just very just like open and curious and talking and just kind. And I think but that was part of his strategy, which I think is so fantastic about it because he was getting information from them and they didn't even realize that he was. And then he would utilize that moving forward in the game. It was really an incredibly impressive balancing act that he was able to do for sure.
Yeah, he mentioned to Rob that the Tika 3 had different people in different groups and were getting all the information from everyone, so they knew where things were leaning. From his standpoint, he had a close relationship with Jamie that we didn't see at all, and she was his window into the Ratu. But as we discussed last week, that was a backup plan, no matter how close they were. As Jam Jam told Mike Bloom, the only thing that happened to Jamie was that she wasn't connecting with the right people at the right time in terms of numbers. But he was. And, when he got to the merge, he talked about the plan for how the three of them would flip back and forth between Soka and Ratu. But it was more than that, too. They instigated active disharmony between the two groups so that they wouldn't get together and realize that Tika was a big part of the problem. Even when Franny saw that and tried, her own tribe mates rejected it. And we heard from people on Ratu that they wouldn't have trusted Soka anyway.
Right.
Now, another way Jam Jam schemed was something he mentioned in Final Tribal Council and several times earlier this season as well. He was a human lie detector. He would build those relationships you were talking about so he could determine when someone was telling the truth and when they were lying. He was very similar to a poker player, watching how an opponent reacts to different kinds of hands so they can find their tells and use it against them. And Jam Jam
Yes.
really made this work well from him. And he was usually accurate, unlike a couple other people we've talked about previously.
Yes, and I think the interesting part about this particular component of his game was that he knew that he couldn't just talk strategy with people. And I think we hear that a lot with some of the players who were like, I was trying to strategize with this person and they weren't interested, or all of a sudden this person who hasn't even spoken to me now is trying to talk
Yeah.
strategy with me. He didn't do that. He included regular conversations with everybody so he could pick up their tells, but then was willing to then also strategize with that person and then kind of meld the information and put it together. And I think this is probably why people didn't catch on to what he was doing, because it wasn't limited in scope. It wasn't like, oh, he only wants me for a vote this time and that's why he's talking to me. No, he talked to everybody all the time. So the strategy was fantastic because he wasn't limited at all, and then was able to utilize the information he learned to then develop his game. It's really just, it's an incredible gift, I must say. Like, great gift that he was able to do that and to pick up on those nuanced tells that people might have that they don't even realize. But he explained it beautifully in his final tribal council. It really did.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, on another aspect of what he was doing was that he and Carolyn actively created the appearance that they were not as close as they seemed. He told Dalton Ross that they would fake arguments, and also said it would sometimes turn into Carolyn getting mad for real, like the Bye Felicia argument at Tribal Council. But at least the plan was to make it seem like they were squabbling. And I'd guess that her actually getting mad helped out in that regard, because they always came back together again.
Yeah, and I think that his strategy with the other players, where we were just talking about knowing what their tells were, he did the same thing with Carolyn and Carson as well, even though they were part of his Tika 3. It wasn't as necessary, I don't think, but he knew how to read Carolyn so well that he knew when he'd gone a little bit too far and she was actually upset, and he knew how to come back from that, and he knew how to respond to it. So I think he was doing the same thing with her and with Carson, probably more Carolyn than he was with Carson, but really understanding how people react and then knowing how to react to those reactions was really a great part of his game.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, uh, basically those three, the Tika 3 that you had mentioned, as Jam Jam laid out in his final tribal council discussions, I posted on Twitter, and now apparently I'm saying it. I keep typing Fibel when I'm trying to say final tribal, and I just said it. So please, let's just call it Fibel Council from now on.
Bible Council.
Tribal. Yeah, Fibel. Not to be confused with the mouse, Fibel. But anyway, the Tika 3 were running the game, and as part of that, he knew what the votes were going to be. He helped maneuver certain people into doing what they wanted, and he helped to plot a course to get to the end. And because of that, it makes sense to continue with the Tika 3, since they all work together in their strategizing as we move along in the first rule here. But each one was slightly different. I would say that they worked a lot like Dominic and Wendell in the way they split up and had their own sub-alliances, such that different people trusted them individually, and nobody worked specifically to go after them, even though we saw what they were doing. It was obvious to us, but clearly not so much to the people in the game itself.
Yes, and I think we have to just blame the edit for a lot of that, right? That, yeah, we were being given a lot of great information that the people who were playing just weren't getting to see.
Yeah. Now, Carson was the closest to Jam Jam in terms of the path that he took. For example, as we discussed last week, while Jamie was very close to Jam Jam, Carson was similarly close to Lauren. The Tika guys would talk to the Ratu women individually and then regroup, and that was how they would guide the outcome of so many post-merge votes. But as I said, the Tika 3 were similar to Dom and Wendell. I would go further and say Carson on his own was similar in gameplay to the original one-person version of Dom and Wendell, Brian Heidick, with a spider web of relationships and information sharing that relied upon the other people not comparing notes. He
Yeah.
told Mike Bloom, my big thing was separating information. If Ratu and Soka never conjoined and talked about different stuff that I had told them, that was good. As long as I kept them not wanting to talk to each other, it would work that way. And that happened with Helen and Sarah versus Carolyn and Jam Jam. And it was
Mm-hmm.
that way really through the whole game as he put himself in the position of the middle, and people thought they were closer to him than he was with anyone else. This is, I mean, this is really a Brian Heidick strategy. I
Yeah.
know Carson, I don't think was even born yet necessarily when Brian Heidick started the strategy. He might have been.
Right.
But clearly, it was something Carson absorbed through his study of the game.
And I think Carson was able to pull this off so well because of his age, really, because he was so young. And I think the way that he presented himself, because he was very, very like, I am not going to let them know who I actually am. Kind of like he
Yeah.
was very firm about that before the game even started. Like, no one's going to know what I actually do. He wanted to appear to be like the little brother, the person that kind of needed help, that needed mothering a little. And it worked really well because that's the relationship that he was able to create with so many people, where they felt like they needed to help him. And so then I think that allowed them to feel more comfortable sharing with him, because he wasn't coming across as someone who was this master strategist early on. And so he was able to really develop these relationships. And then by the time you get to the end, all of a sudden people are like, whoa, wait a second, what
Yeah.
happened?
What just happened here?
Right. It was just this like eye-opening moment where they realized he's fantastic, and he's developed all of these relationships, and he really is a master strategist. But at the beginning, he was able to really hide behind that boyishness and that will you help me kind of persona that he put forth, which I think then allowed him to really get it that much more information from people.
Yeah, I mean, some people saw that he was having different conversations with different people, but they always thought they were the real alliance.
Yeah.
Going
Mm-hmm.
going all the way back to Helen. She told Mike Bloom, I knew that Carson was having a lot of conversation with Jam Jam and Carolyn. I knew he was talking to them, and he would give us information about what they were saying and things like that. He did a great job of playing the middle. We didn't suspect him at all. And then he did the same thing to Ratu when he was swapped. As Brandon told Mike, he played it beautifully. We thought we had him on our side. Even when we
Mm-hmm.
all got on the beach together, he was still coming to us with everything. He was still
Right.
relaying information to us. We thought we had Carson as part of our Ratu pack. Little did we know that was not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Kane said something similar to Gordon Holmes, that Carson made himself part of almost everyone's math, so they went along with him. And he also told Dalton that Carson had a very good strategic relationship with a number of different players. And of course, we know that Carson enjoyed other aspects of scheming and plotting, like when he told us he loved being able to make up lies about people who weren't in the game to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which, as we discussed last week regarding Jamie, is way better than making up lies about people who are still in the game, such that those
Yes.
lies can
If
be
you can't
discovered.
fact check, it's really
Yeah.
helpful for sure.
Yeah.
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 I mean, he might have run into a little bit of an issue if he had made it to the final three, but at that point, it's all gameplay, and you can just say
Right.
this is part of my game, and that's why I
Right.
did it. So yeah, I mean,
Especially if all three Tika 3 had made it together.
right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it
Yeah.
really comes down to a whole lot of managing information between not
Yes.
just Carson and Jam Jam and Carolyn, but like because those three were able to communicate with each other kind of on the down low and people didn't know. So it's like he wasn't burning a bridge by going and talking to other people about Carolyn and Jam Jam, because there was probably like this agreement, like, I'm going to go sprinkle this over here and say this.
Mhm.
And then that way everybody feels like, oh yeah, he's giving us information,
Right.
but Carolyn and Jam Jam are like, it doesn't matter because we are
Yes.
all managing this information together.
Right. Exactly. Now, speaking of Carolyn and Jam Jam, in our preview podcast, I had said I liked Carson's answers about what he wanted in an ally. And I like those answers the best of everyone, because he wanted someone who, no matter what, would never vote me out. And I said at the time, that would be great. But come on, even Ken on your season realized at the end that he had to vote out Dave.
Right.
Well, as
Yeah.
it turns out, Carson found not just one, but two of those people.
Right.
And the three of them made it to Final Four. And all
Yeah.
of them were strategizing together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very impressive. I think that we've never actually seen three people be able to manage their the relationship so well and also avoid being like highlighted as a triplicate, I guess we could say, you know, that people weren't really focusing on them, but they really did manage it impeccably well.
Yeah, I mean, some of these interviews, these pregame interviews with Carson and Carolyn and Jam Jam in particular, they were so accurate in what actually happened that it's kind of scary. Like,
it is.
I know that when players fill out their pregame questionnaires, sometimes we've discussed this before. Sometimes you can go back and be like, yeah, I want to change that before it actually goes public. So if this stuff had only been in the pregame, allegedly pregame questionnaires, I would have been suspect. But these were preseason interviews that he gave, to Mike Bloom and, well, I guess almost all Mike Bloom, now that I think about it, in the preseason. I mean, there was, unless Mike Bloom had a time machine or Carson had a time machine, which I don't give him time, so to speak.
Right. Probably does.
Yeah, that could explain it. Okay, right? Never mind. We have our answer. In the future, Carson invents a time machine, uses it to go back and do the interview with Mike Bloom as young Carson.
But doesn't use it to learn how to make fire better.
Yeah, that would, but that would have changed the outcome. That would change the future, and he might not invent the time machine if he won $1 million.
Interesting. Okay.
It's,
All right. Okay. All right.
Timey-wimey, wibbly wobbly stuff.
Well, I do think it's interesting though that their pregame press was so on point, because one of the things we talked about quite a bit on this podcast is, those best laid plans, right? People come into Survivor and they have their ideas of what they want their game to look like and how they want their game to develop. And we went through various permutations as to who's going to really get close to who. I was actually quite surprised that Carolyn and Jam Jam did end up connecting as much as they did. Yep. I was thinking that she was going to be befriended by someone who would feel like a Helen, who was like a little more like I can help her. But Jam Jam and Carolyn actually just connected because they got along so well. It wasn't just game connection. And so the fact that they were able to come in with a plan and then that plan developed in the way that they wanted it to play out is really, I think, it's a testament to their understanding of Survivor and their understanding of themselves and how they could see themselves playing this game. They really were very honed in on who they were and how they would be perceived. And then they were able to develop their game around that. And I think that because they did it in that fashion, it's almost like a puzzle where it's a little bit malleable. You can make it fit because you understand what you need to do because you understand yourself. So it's a little bit different than having a set idea of how you're going to play the game. It's more of, I know how I am and I know how I can play this game. And then they made it work. And it's just really amazing that the three of them came in with such like strong ideas and then were able to implement them the way that they did.
Yeah, and one other that Carson had was he specifically said pregame he wanted to target the other strategic players early. And who was the first one he knocked out? Helen, right away.
Thanks, Carson.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I can be mad at Carson.
That's right. There
See, it's Carson's fault.
Yeah.
Damn it, Carson.
Yeah. Now, moving to Carolyn, she played a slightly different role within the Tika 3. As Jamie told Rob last week, Carolyn did a great job of playing behind the scenes and letting Jam Jam and Carson build the social relationships. Lauren told Dalton that Carolyn played a great game strategically, but it was behind the scenes and the others didn't really know or see that if they didn't have specific close relationships with her. Danny similarly told Gordon Holmes that people didn't think she was in the driver's seat, but in retrospect, she definitely was sometimes. And this was my worry leading into the finale after having heard Jamie's interviews. And one of the main reasons that I didn't, switch to predict her as a winner, it goes back to the special corollary within Rule 1 here about players keeping their scheming too secret.
Mm-hmm.
such that the jury didn't really know how well they were playing the game. Now, as a reminder, in case any of you didn't go back and read the entire rules, um, prime early example was when JT took all the credit for strategy, even though Steven was at least an equal partner.
Mm-hmm.
A
Right.
more recent and certainly more infamous situation was when Michelle beat Aubrey in Korong, when several of the jurors said after the season that while we saw Aubrey's game on TV, they didn't see it out there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the corollary lists a number of other similar situations, not even limited to just US Survivor. But the key is to find the right balance of scheming and plotting enough that people know you're doing it, but not doing it so much that you get in trouble with the second rule.
Right.
And that situation even came up after Carolyn played her idol and then came back to tell her story. It might have seemed like she was putting a target on herself, but I thought it was actually important for her to get people to realize she was a player before it was too late.
Yeah, because this is one of the issues that you can always kind of guess will become a potential problem
Right.
when you are in an alliance and you're all kind of playing a very close game and you're playing the game together. How do you separate yourself from the
Mm-hmm.
person that you're playing the game with? And if people are looking at this Tika 3 when they're realizing this Tika 3 is a thing, and then they have to compare the games of the last two Tikas sitting in final three, well, who's the one that they think is more in charge? They think it's
Right.
JMJM as opposed to Carolyn. And so you can't then use tribal council to try to explain your game if people haven't seen it. It becomes an uphill battle at that point.
I
And
mean,
so
you
this is
can,
why
but
you
yes, it's
can,
an
but it's
uphill battle, whereas
right.
one person started higher up, which makes it more
Yes.
difficult.
Right. And so that's why there's more pressure on someone who plays a game like Carolyn when you're sitting in that final tribal, because now you have to explain a game to people that didn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily see it. And they need to have the little light bulb moment and go, oh, I do remember that. Okay.
Yeah.
Instead of just talking about things that people are already aware of, and then you're reaffirming what they've already believed as opposed to trying to convince them that this is what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, some people did see that Carolyn was strategic. Both Helen and Sarah talked about it in their interviews, but that was all pre-merge. They weren't in the jury, so that doesn't help Carolyn a whole heck of a
Right.
lot.
Right.
I do think what they said can be instructive because Helen mentioned that Carolyn was very easily underestimated because she seemed like she was so unfiltered and a zany, wacky person, while Sarah said they got distracted by how much personality she brought, that they didn't view her threat level to be as high as it was. I,
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the jury were in that same zone, not realizing all of what was going on in Carolyn's head.
Yeah.
And, we saw it a number of times,
Mm-hmm.
but we weren't in the jury.
Right. Yeah. And again, this is why it becomes very difficult if they don't
Mm-hmm.
see it and they're trying to explain it.
Right.
It can be problematic for someone in that position.
Yeah. Now, moving on from the Tika 3 to runner up Heidi, I know she understood the need to scheme and plot because I found out from her husband on Twitter that they're listeners. So, hi.
Hi.
And she definitely had strategies laid out. The problem is that the show limited her so much in what was put on TV that it's difficult even for us to see everything she was doing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we could sit here and say Carolyn did this and this and this, but the jury didn't see it. We can't even say Heidi did this and this and this because a lot of it we didn't see.
Right. Yeah.
We got some of it in Final Tribal Council and her interviews, but we really need a deep dive. In the meantime, we know she had a strategy to use shields,
Yep.
specifically in a pre-finale Entertainment Weekly interview that was supposed to just be about fun stuff. She dropped a couple of strategic nuggets in there, mentioning that she used Danny as a shield and turned it into a full-on alliance, and that she also used Franny as a shield. In fact, she told Jeff in his podcast interview that she picked Danny as an ally in pregame Ponderosa because he was loud and confident.
Mm-hmm.
Danny?
Yeah.
Really? No way. And it's funny because she said in the pregame that she was looking for an ally who was opposite her, tall and young. Now, I thought it might be Matt, but Danny certainly fit the bill, which is
Right.
good because someone else grabbed Matt.
Someone else did.
Yeah.
Good for you, Franny.
Yeah. Now, Heidi knew she needed shields because, as she told Mike Bloom, I could see that the battle between Soka and Tika was coming. So I knew if the battle is going to happen, then the people in the middle are just going to go through. And at that time, I tried to make an alliance with them. As
Mm.
she said also in that Entertainment Weekly article, she was looking for people similar to him or to her. Quote, the non flashy people who were playing the same, who were playing the game mega hard and smart, but were not seen as threats. And she told Rob that while they didn't show it, she was pretty close with Jam Jam and Carolyn. And they even talked early in the merge about getting to the top 3 together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She did seem to indicate that the relationship she had with Jam Jam was much more than we had seen, and that there were actual discussions had amongst the two of them about not necessarily being able to become a duo.
Right.
So I thought that that was interesting that we didn't get to see that either. But I do think that this goes back to Jam Jam trying to really work the room in the way
Right.
that he was, and he wanted as many options as possible. So I can appreciate the fact that those conversations were had, but I do think that Heidi's plan going into the game is, again, she talked about what her strategy was pregame and she stuck to it when she
Right.
got there. But I think that, the problem for her was because you then end up utilizing those shields and allowing other people to be the flashy move makers, if you will, then you run into a very similar issue like Carolyn, where people are seeing that and they're not seeing Heidi. And so that is another difficult tightrope to walk because it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. It's not like Carson was like, I'm going to get rid of the threats, whereas Heidi's like, I'm going to hide behind them and let them go first. But unfortunately, we just didn't end up seeing as much of her because of the strategy that she was utilizing.
Right. Now, a few things that she did have come out, and I had figured out at least a couple of them back when they happened. I thought that when she told Carson and Jam Jam about the idol, even though she didn't need to, about Danny's idol, even though she didn't need to, better specify which idol, it was probably to establish trust with them, and she verified that in a couple interviews. As she told Mike Bloom, neither Carson nor Jam Jam threw her name out after that because of that connection.
Yeah.
And this also played into why she didn't join up with Jamie and Lauren last week to get out of Tika. We figured that she didn't trust them and knew that if she worked with them at that point, she'd have been the next one out. And that's exactly what she said in her interviews.
Yep.
Now, another aspect of Heidi's strategy was that she said on Jeff's podcast she couldn't play as her true self and had to keep herself quiet, which enabled her to make it far into the game. And she knew she had to make it to the end to get her story told. The supervising producer, Brittany, on Jeff's podcast, talked about how she could see so much change in the videos of Heidi as they went along. Boy, wouldn't it have been nice if they had shown more of those to us so we could see all those changes too, Brittany?
Yeah, that would have been great. Thank you.
But we did, see Heidi scheming in other situations. For example, in the first Soka vote, she had to decide which side to go with. As Franny said, Heidi would take advice into consideration and then make the decision she thought was best for her own game, which is exactly what players should do.
Right.
Beyond that, Heidi said in an interview that getting Brandon out was largely her, and we saw some of that. But the interesting thing is that just as, we discussed Carolyn's game not being seen by some of the others, and you also have already discussed Heidi's, Carson specifically said that about Heidi's game, that, he saw her game from his perspective while she saw it differently. And, we even saw that in Final Tribal Council with her trying to correct Jam Jam and him shooting back and saying, no, actually, Tika was controlling in those situations.
Right. Yes. Can I just say that particular moment was fantastic for Jam Jam, just
Not
because
so much for Heidi. Yeah.
Not so much for Heidi. And I only mention that because the response that Heidi when Heidi went, oh, it was like she was acknowledging that snap. That was not me. That was
snap.
I thought I had something here.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, but that again goes back to the managing of information that the Tikas were doing. And so the fact that Heidi thought that she was leading the charge on certain things, they were like, great, this is lovely. She can certainly think that if she wants, but we're the ones that are really pulling the strings, and she just doesn't need to know that. So yeah, I mean, she certainly thought that she had more influence over the game than she actually did, and that's just because of the Tika 3.
Yeah. Now, as we move to Lauren, a lot of what we could say about her in this rule is similar to what we said about Jamie last week because they were working so closely together. They had an alliance with Carson and Jam Jam and thought they had those two on their side. We described it last week as them being bamboozled into thinking they were the main alliance when they were really a side alliance. And Lauren seemed to somewhat acknowledge that in her interview with Rob. But as it seemed like they were going to get into it, it went down a different path. So I'm not 100% sure, and I don't want to put words into her mouth, but she did tell Mike Bloom that Carson played her and used her.
Yes, and I think that it has to be a very hard realization after the fact when you're starting to see on TV what was happening, or maybe you're hearing about it at Ponderosa, maybe you're hearing about it after the game, but to know that you were not in as much control as you thought you were, because I really do think that Lauren had also a very good sense of herself and how she wanted to play this game. And I think that she and Heidi were very similar in how they did kind of pull themselves back a little bit instead of being like the Jam Jam that was everybody's friend, because that was more in tune to how they wanted to play the game. But by doing that, they were just also feeding into the Tika 3. So it's like it was just difficult, like spiral that they found themselves in that they didn't even know they were in. So I'm sure that watching it back was probably difficult for them.
Yeah, yeah. And on top of it, of course, we know that Lauren was criminally short on confessionals for someone who made it so far in the game. There were a few times when she showed that she had some strategy in her game plan, but we just didn't see nearly as much as we should have.
Right.
But that's often the problem with being the backup alliance, which, of course, you don't know at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, one thing she told Mike Bloom was that while we saw Matthew giving Carson a lot of information when he arrived at Ratu, what we didn't see was Carson running straight to Lauren to tell her about Jamie's idol and also his own from the journey leading to the swap. And this led to them becoming close, which leads to that whole backup alliance thing again.
Right.
And it also explains, kind of going back to what you were just saying, why she was upset on Twitter when people were criticizing her and Jamie for voting the way they did a couple weeks ago, because none of us knew anything about that alliance even existing at that point.
Right. Yeah. So we were just as surprised as you were, Lauren.
Yeah.
Just in a different way.
More surprised. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, that was rule 1. The rest of the rules won't be that long. Some will, but the rest of them won't.
47 minutes.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, well, that wasn't all rule 1.
No, it wasn't. We'll get through it.
Yeah. The second rule, in fact, is going to be significantly shorter because it says not to scheme and plot too much and to keep your scheming secret. And I find that I don't have that much for this one. I suspect it's likely because these are the final 5, and the people who really schemed and plotted too much were the ones I was talking about earlier who made the big moves. They were voted out already.
Right. Well, and I really do think, keeping it a secret, I mean, this was part of the key strategy for Tika. So we really can't fault them for doing anything too flashy, Jeff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Tika 3 worked very hard to make it look like they weren't the Tika 3.
Right.
I mean, we know a duo is trouble. A trio, triple trouble.
Right. But nobody saw it except maybe Franny at one point. She was like, hey, you see what's going on over there?
And they were like, bye. Yeah. But yeah, they kept everyone off balance in the way we talked about. And by the time the other players started taking action to get rid of them, it was too late, in part because the trio had several of the others in their back pockets, as we said.
Yeah. I think really the only big potential, I mean, I don't even know if I want to say it's an issue here, but Heidi didn't end up wanting to work with Lauren because of her knowledge that Lauren and Jamie had been close and they had obviously been trying to vote her out. And so, I think that that's one thing that she did see was that, I don't want to end up playing with them because they don't want to play with me. So that wasn't, I guess that was a little more noticeable from other players' standpoint. And so that really limited Heidi in what options she thought she had because of those two being close and kind of discounting her at one point.
Right. Exactly. But yeah, I mean, to go back to the Tika 3 for a minute, a key part of this rule, it's in the title, I just don't always mention it, is not to backstab until you need to. And the Tika 3 held it together where many alliances, I would say almost every alliance we've seen in recent seasons, would have jumped the gun on each other. They're always like looking at each other like, well, they're going to get me at this point, so I got to get them at that point. But I would say a large share of the credit for this, from what we saw, goes to Carson for knocking down, for example, the idea of voting out Carolyn. But the other thing is, Carson was pretty sure he could win out of the three of them in the end. So, of course, it made sense for him not to worry about it.
Right.
If I can beat you, of course I want to take you to the end.
Yeah. And then I'm going to make it appear as if I'm incredibly loyal. And because, yes, if you are sure that you can beat someone and then also not cut them in the process, it does make you look better in front of a jury.
Yeah. And, but there were also times when Carolyn was mad at Jam Jam, we talked about, and she could have fled, but didn't.
Right.
They all kept it together until the point where it was out of their hands in Heidi's.
Right. Well, and Jam Jam did mention as well, one of the issues with taking out either of them, if you had voted out Carson or if you had voted out Carolyn and put them on the jury, he loses a vote. Now he knows if the other one is sitting next to him, that vote's going to that person. And so he was cognizant of that as well in the decision of, I'm not going to vote one of them out because then I'm going to lose that person's vote.
Yeah, I do think if it had been Carson, I think he could have put it aside. I don't know, because of the relationship that Jam Jam and Carolyn had, I don't know that either of them, it would have depended who else was sitting there.
Sure.
In the end. But moving from the Tika 3 and back to Heidi, she was well aware of this rule. And she explained in her interviews that even though she had that connection with Jam Jam, well, actually, you brought this up earlier. They knew that they couldn't appear to be a duo. So they would, they avoided being too close. They didn't speak Spanish to each other, just examples like that. But I think the most important part of Heidi understanding this rule was the way she was repeatedly spot on in something that I mentioned before we even got to the rules, which was noting that, of course, you have to take risks, but it's a matter of when and how you do it. And in at least the one case that, I mentioned, she had to fire back at Jeff in tribal council when he was pushing those risky moves, that we mentioned in the segment on why he's wrong so much.
That's like your favorite segment.
It really is. I wish we didn't have it. Let me be clear about that. I wish we didn't need to have it. I wish Jeff would listen to us and transform into being right. We would make a shirt that says, Jeff, you're right. But you got to earn it, Jeff. You got to earn it. You haven't done that. What you've earned, Jeff, is the why Jeff is wrong about blank segment.
I'm sorry, Jeff. I still think you're fabulous, but
I know you think he's fabulous, but yeah.
But there's some things there. I will say, just on an aside, I realize that we're, in the middle of the rule, but I did see there was something, he was in an interview very recently, and they asked him, like, if you were to suggest, like, what seasons of Survivor someone should binge, like, what are your suggestions? And Millennials versus Gen X was like his third answer, I do believe. So I was like, thank you very much. So I'm just saying. So thanks, Jeff. Thanks for that.
Well, it's because you made the big move there.
Yeah. That was not the big move I should have made, but we did do that, didn't we? We did. Yeah. I mean, if it had worked out for me, like it did work for Adam.
It was that. Oops, there it is.
Yes. Yeah. Very sad.
Wow.
Very
took
sad
a long time for me to get to be able to point to that. Okay. All right. Well, you said we were in the middle of the rule 2. Actually, we were at the end, so it was a perfect time.
Okay, great.
Because the third rule tells players to be flexible. And I think it's pretty clear that the Tika 3 did well here.
Oh,
In the
yes.
in the finale, Jam Jam said the key to Survivor is to know what's going on and be aware of what's happening behind the scenes. That could have come straight from this rule, where I say you need to have your finger on the pulse of every member of the tribe.
Hmm.
Between Jam Jam, Carson, and Carolyn, they definitely did because, as we discussed in the first rule, they were getting information from all
Yeah.
the sides.
Hmm.
We discussed in Why Brandon Lost how Jam Jam specifically said that his game plan was to get through and have options afterwards. And,
Hmm.
the Tika 3 wanted to make sure both sides thought they were with them. And it worked. They ended up sticking mostly with Soka after that, but they had the option to jump to Ratu. And in the meantime, of course, Jam Jam and Carson had their backup alliance with two of the
Right.
Ratu.
Yeah. Yeah. If anyone was flexible, I think the flexibility that they presented was just amazing because
Yeah,
they really did keep their options so open, but they did it in a way that was very unseen. People didn't
right.
realize that this is what they were doing. So it really allowed them to have so many more options. So when they were actually having discussions at the well about what they should do and how they should vote, they weren't locked into anything. They really could talk through these options and how is it going to affect them and how is it going to help move the
Mm-hmm.
game forward? How can they use their vote strategically as opposed to I'm just going to vote because this is the way that the vote is going. I mean, that I think was an incredible component of their games was how they voted and how that vote would allow them to still have those options available to them because their vote made it appear as if they were a
Right.
particular way as opposed to I'm locked in with this particular group of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the key to this rule, which, when everyone pulls up the rules and looks at it, is right there in bright red in this rule. It says you cannot just tie yourself to one alliance and hope that it survives.
Mhm.
And we mentioned last week that while, they were Tika strong, they had that backup. Even at the
Yeah.
end, almost all the way to the very end, they had that backup in case something happened where, like, Carolyn was eliminated somehow.
Mhm.
And they didn't break from the two Ratu until it was absolutely necessary.
Right.
Now, in contrast to what Jam Jam and Carson did, their backup ally, Lauren, told Mike Bloom, deep down in my heart, I was ready to be Ratu strong to the very end. Now, she
Yeah.
did note that she wanted to have relationships with other people, and she did build other bonds, but like we said for Jamie last week, I think she held on to that tribal alliance too long.
Yeah. I mean, the only benefit that that could have served her would have been jury votes. But I think that it has to become very telling when you're continuing to look at who you're working with and those people
Mm-hmm.
are continuing to be voted out
Bing,
that you
bing,
need to
bing.
be able right, you need to be able to have that flexibility because otherwise you're going to be joining them as well. I mean, she ended up joining them and she didn't want to, but I mean,
I mean,
who
the
doesn't?
jury was Ratu strong.
Right, the jury was definitely Ratu
Yeah.
strong, and so I think that is a very telling component of the issue with being so solid and locked into
Mm-hmm.
one option as opposed to having multiple options. Yes, and that's where it
Yeah.
ended up was in the jury instead of in the final 3.
Yeah. Now, anticipating a response to this, I think someone could say, but wait, didn't Carson say he wanted a Tika to win? Which Carson did say that in interviews.
Mhm.
And they could say, how is that different? Well, the answer is he said that after he was voted out. Before then, he wanted a Tika named Carson to win. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and he
It was
wanted,
a very specific Tika.
yes, yes. In his case, it made sense to go Tika strong to the end because, as I mentioned earlier, he believed he could beat the other two Tika at the end. And of course, we
Mhm.
mentioned he had the backup just in case.
Right.
And also Carson came into the game with a plan to play into whatever people thought of him in his youth. So he intended to be flexible from the very start.
Yes.
Now, Heidi also showed her flexibility in the way she stayed close to Danny and Soka, but also made those overtures we mentioned to Tika, so she could move forward with the group that she believed had the best chance of making it to the end. That even meant voting against Danny one time, though she explained in interviews that she knew he wouldn't be voted out, but she wanted to show the others that she could do it.
Mm, mhm.
From something Danny said in the reunion, She apparently discussed that in Final Tribal Council, but they didn't show it.
Yeah.
Like I think Jeff asked him, why did you vote for her? And he mentioned a couple things, and that was one of the things. And it was like, wait, we didn't see that part. Why'd they leave that in there? Yeah.
Yeah. Editing.
Yeah. All right. Well, the fourth rule tells players not to let their emotions control them. And I want to make clear that this is indeed what I mean. This is about controlling your game actions. This rule isn't saying not to have emotions or not to show emotions, but rather not to let them dictate your gameplay. It is fine to be emotional as long as you are not playing emotionally. And the reason I'm spelling this out is because I think we need to explain this, because there are two of the final three players who did show their emotions quite a bit. Sometimes they even considered voting with their emotions or their heart, as they most often phrased it. But in the end, from what we saw, they always came back to their heads for those decisions.
Yes. Yeah. And I do think that that is a necessary division or split or explanation to provide, because I mean, Carolyn is probably one of the most emotional players we've seen in like forever, but she was very aware of that about herself. And we would see this in confessionals over and over again, where she would say, I can't play with my emotions. And that's when I would see, David Bloomberg floating behind her when she would say these things, because she even knew that.
That should have been a TikTok I did, was insert myself saying,
oh, you still
can't
can.
do
There's
it. You
plenty
can't
of
do it. That's true. That's true.
You definitely can. But I do think that the one, and I'm sure we're going to touch upon this later, just when she was in that final tribal, I think that was where she did focus too heavily on her emotions necessarily.
Yeah. We'll
And
get to
so,
that in Appendix B, right?
yeah. So I do think, though, that she did recognize that about herself, and she knew enough to not let that control her. And she did have to kind of check herself, because there were those like the bye Felicia moments where she did get angry at Jam Jam, but she was able to recover and come back from it. And so again, this goes back to you understanding yourself and how you are. And though she knows that she's an emotional person, she also knew that that's not how she could play this game. But it also, just to add, I think people thought that that's how she was playing her game, because that's what she presented. And so it's this interesting dynamic that Carolyn was able to have in this game, where people thought it was an emotional game she was playing, but it actually was a very non-emotional game, just with just emotion being seen. So, I think that she was able to balance it really well and kind of throw people off because of it.
Yeah. And the thing is, keeping a friend in the game is not necessarily a bad thing. We saw Jam Jam saying he was debating between his head and his heart when he appeared to be deciding between keeping Carolyn or Jamie. But I said at the time, and I reiterate here, I think he made made the right choice for both his head and his heart in doing that. It was emotionally the best thing for him, and it was also game-wise the best thing for him.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, because both Carolyn and Jam Jam had this issue come up a number of times, it got a lot of focus on the show. I was talking about the TikToks. I think Rule 4 made an appearance in my TikToks more than, this season than it ever has before. But Carolyn repeatedly explained it correctly. You can have emotions and be strategic if you play it right.
Yes.
But like you said, we also heard her say, be logical, don't be emotional. And, we know that Voce said when, he was on the podcast that she was basically, like you said, speaking my voice. And
yes.
Yeah, that would have been great if she had said, David says, be logical.
That would have been so awesome.
They would have cut
that would have been
David's
in every one of your TikToks,
I know,
all the time.
But they would have cut that, because they would have been like, "Who's this David guy?"
Right, and they'd be like, "We don't have an NDA signed by this guy, so you can't talk about him."
So
many particular things with this show.
Yes. Now, Jam Jam came into the game thinking about this very issue. He talked about how much he liked Sandra and how hardcore she was with the way she was able to separate her emotions, adding that he thought he'd be able to make the tough decisions by taking emotions out, which again, he did. Another thing from his pregame that he talked about. So now, the Tika were not the only ones who had to go through this. And Heidi also did a good job of controlling her emotions. As she noted to Mike Bloom, for her, part of that was changing the way she came across, staying quieter than she would be in normal life to avoid negative attention. And, we, of course, also saw how she could turn against Danny if need be, despite the bond that grew between them. And even earlier in the season, Claire discussed in interviews how close she was to Heidi, but Heidi put that aside when she thought it was strategically better for her to go in a different direction.
Right.
I mean, we even saw after she and Claire spoke, Claire got very emotional, noted that Heidi's vote would send her packing. Heidi had a confessional with the perfect quote related to this rule, saying, "I'm in it for me. I'm in it for my family, not for them."
Right. Yeah.
That says it all right there.
It does, for sure. I think overall we had a really strong final group of people that understood the dynamics of this game very well and understood what needed to be set aside in order to further their own game. We talk often about how people need to play this game to win. And I feel like this final five, that's really what they were all kind of putting out there. They were really willing to make the best decision for themselves as opposed to getting caught up in the emotions of things.
Yeah. And I mean, Jamie said it an episode or two earlier. She said, we can all meditate together and then, become cutthroat.
Right. Yeah.
So, okay, we can move to the fifth rule, which reminds players they need to pretend to be nice and play the social game. I think we could skip this rule. It didn't come into play at all. Nobody on the season had a good social game. They were all mean and nasty to each other. Let's just go to the sixth rule, okay? So all right, fine, just kidding. Obviously,
I think this one is going to take some time.
Yeah. This rule was extremely important through the season.
Yes.
And I felt like that was going to be the case even before it started because, as we had mentioned, both Jam Jam and Carolyn talked about hiding their strategy behind their personalities.
Right.
I even said in the preseason podcast that Jam Jam felt people would think he's a happy-go-lucky guy and not taking things seriously, adding, "I know we've heard that a lot." And this was me adding, but I think if anyone can pull it off, it'll probably be Jam Jam. Have I mentioned that I was right about that?
It's right here, okay?
Yeah, I know.
You can see it on my shirt.
Yes. That was for the listeners.
The listeners, okay.
Yeah. Similarly, Carolyn talked in the preseason about how she thought people would perceive her as goofy, spontaneous, and free-spirited. But she also said her alliances would go deeper than strategy because her bonds would be real. Now, in this case, I have to admit, I didn't think the others in the game would put as much stock in that, especially since that shorter game doesn't allow as much time for those real bonds to form. But she did not need very long to form those super tight bonds with people like Carson and Jam Jam and even Bruce, who was there for like 5 minutes.
Right.
It was like her superpower. Just after Helen and Sarah said they wanted to vote out Carolyn, Carson went to Carolyn and Jam Jam and said, "I want to be a part of your life." And I remember that. That stuck with me the whole season long.
Yeah.
And now he is.
Yeah, they really are. They're going to have like their own show or something at some point.
Apparently they all got like lip plumping injections together after the season. So that was on social media.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So
that's incredible. That's incredible.
Yeah. Everybody go check that out. It's fairly hysterical.
That is quite funny.
Yeah. But anyway, going back to Jam Jam, he really did a great job of using humor and his social game to move past awkward situations. For example, many times in history, after a tribal council where someone gets votes, they're angry or they don't want to talk about it. Just leave me alone.
Yeah.
But he addressed it head on and he put people at ease. Lauren told Dalton Ross flat out that he had the best social game and was so genuine, relating to them on personal levels. Even going way back to Sarah, she told Mike Bloom she loved Jam Jam, and he did the little things to put people at ease, using his humor and making everything fun.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that he actually told Jeff was that he did not disregard anyone. And I thought that was really an incredible thing for him to note going into this game and then to carry through with this game. Even when, as you mentioned, he had been voted for, he immediately went to that person and acknowledged that person and didn't let there be this awkward silence or awkwardness build between them, and basically like made them feel good about the choice they made. Like, I understand why you did that and it's okay. I'm not going to hold it against you. We can move forward, which I think is a really incredible point to make just in regards to his social game, because he never let that affect things moving forward. And that helped in all of these other rules with his flexibility, keeping things open and having options in the game, because he never discounted anyone. He didn't disregard anyone. And that, as a player, is an incredible skill to have, because to take that anger and to put it aside, even though he was like, you write my name down, I'm going to vote you out, which I think was hysterical that he did manage to do that so many times. But he didn't let that other person feel that way. He didn't let that other person know that that's what he was doing. So that was really a huge part of his game in order to get him to continue to move forward.
Yeah. And, this turned out to be especially important at the split merge tribe vote. The split merge tribe vote. The split. Anyway.
Whatever that thing was.
Yeah. There had just been a tribal council where Jam Jam was a target, but he immediately worked on fixing things. As Matt told Mike Bloom, Jam Jam, to his credit, had worked things out with Brandon. He had built a rapport with Jamie and Lauren. We didn't know how big a rapport it was at the time.
Right.
And we discussed in the Why Matt Lost podcast how much that helped save Jam Jam there.
Right.
Now, I want to emphasize that this sort of thing is what we mean when we talk about having a social game. Because I remember when we were discussing, I think it was season 43, but it could have been 42. We had several players. They were social and well-liked, but it didn't turn into anything for their games.
Right.
And, we talked about that. Yes, you were social, but did you have a social game?
Right.
Pretending to be nice is a good start, because you don't want to get yourself voted out for being a jerk. But then taking it a step further is what really helps. You use your social play to help your strategic game.
Yes. And that's what he found the balance of so nicely.
Right.
Because it was this, I will connect with everyone and I will have a relationship with everyone. And then they won't even realize how I'm actually utilizing them in my own game and to further my own game, because I have an actual relationship with them. And so that's something that we were already talking about in this podcast, where he's not only approaching people when he needs their vote. He's approaching people all the time. Even when they voted for him, he's still approaching these people. And so that's allowing him to keep all of his options open and to build those relationships. And it's both strategic and social. And it just helped him have all of these, the ability to maneuver through the game. And then to add having Carolyn and Carson there with him to carry this through, who were also building relationships with people and also forming bonds. And then the three of them, it was like they all kind of had this superpower that just was times 3, because they had 3 people doing it and utilizing it in the way that they were.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, another example is what Lauren said about each of the final 3, noting that Jam Jam formed personal relationships with her and others. But meanwhile, she didn't have that kind of relationship with Carolyn, because she was more behind the scenes, as we discussed in the first role, or with Heidi, because they were on opposite sides of the game. But, going to Carolyn, those who knew her loved her. And I mentioned before, Bruce, he was not there for very long. But he said that in his short time, they chatted about his family, her life, things she'd gone through, etc. And he found her to be an amazing human being. I mean, from what I've seen and heard and know about her, I totally agree. But he learned that in just a very short time.
Yeah. Yeah. Very impressive.
Yeah. Moving to Carson, it's interesting because we didn't get as much social information specifically about him. And yet we know people talked about him being everyone's little brother or son or whatever. He worked his way into their hearts to the point that they were openly singing his praises at tribal council in front of the jury. Talk about how proud they were of him.
Mm-hmm.
And, in his interviews, we found out more details, including that he had relationships with Matt and Franny, and separately with Kane, and separately with Danny, and separately with Brandon.
Mm-hmm.
And these relationships were, I think, similar to Jam Jam's. They were strategic, but they were also friendship or mentor or whatever he needed
Yeah.
them to be.
Right.
He
And
said with Danny
that's the
that it
key
was
point. Yeah.
a leader to leader relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I really think that that's what he and Jam Jam were so good at, is finding the thing about that other person that made them connect and
Mhm.
making that the focus of the relationship. So it wasn't about Carson. It wasn't about Jam Jam. It was always about that other person.
Right.
And then that was how they developed the relationship. And that was what they focused on. It was like a very needs oriented. Like, what does that person need from me? And that's what I'm going to give them, instead of what do I need from them. And
Right.
I don't think enough people really do that in this game, where they focus more so on the person on the receiving end instead of themselves, but they
Mhm.
do it in order to benefit themselves. It was,
Right.
and they both did that very, very well, which is why as you said, it was what type of relationship, whether leadership, mentor, little brother,
Mhm.
it just worked for him. And then it made people just ingratiated to him, and they just really appreciated him on a different level.
Yeah, I mean, he told Mike Bloom that he was able to get really close with people in terms of listening to them and being friends with them. But
Mm-hmm.
we also know he kept certain aspects of himself hidden, leading to some great surprise faces at the reunion when
Yes.
he revealed that, in the words of Elton John, he's not the man they think he is at all. Oh, no, no, no. He's a rocket man. Uh, and by the way, I
Yeah.
made a TikTok of that, and it rocketed, pun intended. It In just a few days, it has become my most viewed TikTok ever, beating out a previous one featuring also Carson.
I liked the Muppet one personally.
Yeah, that one. I mean, that one was good and
That was great.
was well viewed. And I got a number of comments saying this is the funniest thing you've ever done. Which, on the one hand, it's like, wow, that makes me feel good. On the other hand, it's like, well, what about the other 1,100 that I did?
Well, that one made
Yes,
me laugh out loud for
yes.
sure. That
Oh,
was
good,
great.
good. And hopefully you like the Rocket Man one too.
Yes. But I
Um,
just the Muppet, I
yes,
prefer the Muppet one personally. It's
yes,
just
okay.
me.
Now I he never told anyone again that he was, the Rocket Man.
Right.
Um, I heard from someone because I was wondering what did he tell them. I heard from someone that he told them something like he was a business student, which sounds less threatening, I guess.
Sure.
He obviously didn't have to make up lies about the whole huge chunks of his life like Josh tried to do, because it
Yeah.
was really just like a few things about college. But I wonder
Yeah.
how much it even came up. Like with Josh, it was just so obvious that people were like
Mm.
questioning him. I suspect that Carson was like, "Oh yeah, I'm a college student. I, do this," and they're like, "Okay."
Well, and again, I think this goes back to understanding your audience and understanding yourself, and how do you
Hmm.
present yourself. And when Josh was trying to present himself in a particular way, he wasn't hiding the truth about himself the way that he should. Whereas I
Right.
think Carson understood, I need to hide this. And in order to hide this, I really have to hide this.
Yeah.
And so it was presenting himself as just this college student. And he was young. So that certainly worked to his
Yeah, I was
benefit.
gonna say that. He looked about 12,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's
The
not like
age
he had to.
definitely helped.
Right, right. He didn't have to, try to, make up, okay, well, this is what I was doing for this many years time
Right,
gap.
which is what they noticed about Josh. Like, where have
Right.
you been for like 10 years? What did you do in
Yeah.
between? Like, how does that work out?
Yes.
Whereas,
Coincidentally, the amount of time that it would take to go to med school and residency.
right, exactly. So if you have people that are really smart figuring these things out. So Carson was able to use the truth about him in
Hmm.
a way because of his age, that you can just, yeah, focus on college. But yes, the faces at the final tribal when he mentioned
Yeah.
NASA was quite entertaining.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, as we move on from the Tika 3, this rule is another place where we were drastically shortchanged when it came to Heidi and Lauren. We
Mm-hmm.
know Heidi formed a good bond with Danny, and she had that kind of unspoken or less spoken thing with Jam Jam. She seemed to get along well with Carolyn. I'm just not sure how much she was able to turn that into social capital. Obviously some, because like she said, she went along to the end with them. They had
Right.
discussions about it. They didn't bring up her name. And, much the same is true of Lauren. She told Dalton she just wished we would have seen more of her relationships in general, like with Carson, who was super close to her, and, Jam Jam as well. But, leaving out whole relationships is certainly something you know about from your own playing days.
I do. It is very frustrating when you have an entire relationship left out of an entire season. Yeah. So I feel you, ladies. I definitely feel you.
Yeah. And
But according to Jeff
also
Probst,
in
because I
Lauren's
know
case, it was a relationship with the winner. Huh.
I know,
And Heidi's case too, actually. Yeah.
right?
So.
Like, hi, it seems to be a significant part of the story, but I guess not. But I will say that going back to something that Jeff Probst said, because I know how you love to talk about Jeff and how he's right about everything, right? He was like, "There's no such thing as a winner's edit. We don't do that." Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. Yep.
I mean, I have heard from editors who say, yes, we edit each episode individually, but then they are told, because they have to tell a story in an episode. But you cannot tell me that someone didn't tell them, go back and insert those reflections of the fire in Carson's glasses in these different spots. Go back and put in that part about Carson saying he wants to be part of their lives. Go back and there were definitely times where the outcome determined what was in a given episode.
How about they started the entire season with Carolyn doing that?
Yes.
Breaking the fourth wall.
Right.
And then they did it again in the very last episode. So yes, they are definitely. Yeah,
they had Heidi making fire in No Time Flat at Soka.
Yes,
it's. I mean, not everything comes up in the end, but there is an edit, and there is a. I mean, not every winner gets a ton of time.
Sure.
But there. And maybe that's God, here I am defending Jeff. What is wrong with this world? Maybe that's what he meant by there's no winner's edit. There's no one particular winner's edit. They did not edit Erica the same way that they edited Jam Jam.
Right.
I would like to think, part of it is everybody plays different games. And even after 44 seasons, Survivor production still hasn't figured out how to show a purely social game.
Right.
We could see that, going back to 39 with Tommy, even. They don't know how to do it.
Right. They did a better job with Jam Jam because so much of his game.
But Jam Jam's was strategic.
Right. But it's this weird,
They could, yes, he made all those friendships, but he had this, first of all, he had this outward huge personality.
Yeah.
And there were lots of scenes of him specifically discussing strategy, which led to it all the way up to the final tribal council, which we'll get to, And so, but if it's just a game where it's social and people like you and it's not as much strategic, that is very difficult for them. They just haven't figured it out.
No,
hire me.
There you go.
Yes. I'm sure that's exactly what Jeff wants to do is hire
That's
me.
exactly what Jeff wants to do.
Prove that you're open to change, Jeff. Or open to criticism or open to hearing another side of things. Come on, Jeff, you can do it. Anyway, we should probably move into the sixth rule rather than, me handing Jeff my resume. It warns against being too much of a threat, as I might be to Jeff. Or in the words of Jam Jam from the episode 10 Tribal Council, it's not good to be too great.
Yeah.
Many of the players we've talked about already this season, and indeed in the previous several seasons, have gone out in large part due to this rule. The threats manage to hold on for a while, and then they turn on each other and fall like a row of dominoes. Good players have to hide their threat level somehow, whether using shields or seeming to be weak or whatever. Jam Jam told Rob that he, Carolyn, and Carson all understood that coming into the merge, that not looking like they were big threats definitely helped them. And, Ratu and Soka just weren't worried about them until it was too late. Also, Ratu considered Carson as one of their own, leaving only Jam Jam and Carolyn, so even less threatening. They all just didn't realize that those three were playing the middle, and by voting the way they did, the Tika 3 kept up the charade.
Yeah, and part of their threat level was because there was 3 of them. And the fact that that wasn't noticed just helped them further their own game, because really you've 3 votes instead of 1, right? And you've got 3 minds that are working the minds of the other people that are around you. And so you can dissuade this idea that you are too much of a threat if this person only thinks, well, Jam Jam's with me and Jam Jam's working with me, when in actuality, Jam Jam is working everybody. But he's doing that with these tentacles that he's put out and, are coming through Carolyn and Carson, and they're all doing that same thing, and nobody is aware that that's what's happening. So their threat level was huge because there was 3 of them, but they were able to manage it so well. No one saw it coming.
Right.
Except Franny.
Yeah. Of course, within the Tika 3, one player stood out head and shoulders above the others as being too much of a threat. That would be Carson. As he told Mike Bloom, I think that everyone saw me as the front runner. Even from a jury perspective, when I got there, they were all like, man, you would have won. But, don't just take Carson's word for it. Lauren told Mike, Carson could have beat anybody in Final Tribal just because he was just that great of a player.
Yeah.
In his own final episode, Danny said that if he were in the jury and had to vote for either Carson or a clone of himself to win, he'd probably pick Carson. Jamie told Mike, I think Carson had thought he was hiding how great of a game player he was, but we knew that anybody that's there next to Carson, it would be a challenge for them to win. So yeah, Carson tried to hide it, and he did for a long time.
Yes.
But eventually it became obvious, which is something I figured would happen in our preview podcast. As I said, it would be tough, but he would still obviously want and need to make strategic moves. And when you make those moves, eventually people catch on. But yeah, he kept it under wraps for most of the game, just not quite long enough. And
but I think part of his threat level too wasn't just his strategic chops, but also the 3D printing of all of the puzzles.
They didn't know that part.
They didn't know that, but they saw him getting those puzzles done very, very quickly. And so
yeah, but by that time he wasn't a threat for that reason, because it's not like, after he won the Final 5 challenge, his puzzle making skills were meaningless.
Right. But he had been. It's just. I feel like it was something that was overlooked, even though it was something that they probably should have made note of.
Yeah. And, certainly he could have mentioned, I won 2 immunity challenges. But though the immunity challenges were spread out, I don't think anyone really cared about that in the end. And yeah, he was just, trying to hide the different things that he was doing. And along the way, there were definitely some funny scenes. Like at one point, I remember he exaggeratedly pretended like, I just don't know what's going to happen. And I'm like, okay, nice there, Carson.
Right. And I think someone even said in front of him, how are we supposed to compete with someone who builds things in their backyard?
He said that.
Oh, he's the one that said that?
Yeah.
I thought somebody said it in front of him.
No, and I know this because until Rocket Man, that was my top performing TikTok, was he said, how can we compete with that? And then it's like immediately cut to him telling us, well, actually I did, 3D printing.
Well, I thought Helen was the one who said it. Maybe I'm just misremembering. But yeah,
others were talking about it, but he definitely was like very out there, like, like, how can we compete with that?
I do remember him talking about
like,
it. In
almost, if it had been a sitcom, it would have been cut to camera, turned to camera and being like,
a little wink.
Yeah. But yeah. Now, after Carson, there was some debate about who was the next biggest threat. Danny, Heidi, and Jamie all talked about what a huge threat Jam Jam was at the end and how likable he was. But then Jamie stood with him for that vote and more, in part because Carson and Jam Jam peddled the story to them that Carolyn was actually the bigger threat.
Right.
And while Jamie and Lauren and others didn't necessarily see it that way because she'd been mostly behind the veil, it made enough sense to use as a decoy plan. But
Mm-hmm.
as we discussed earlier, her threat level was indeed masked because of how she was playing.
Yeah. Yeah. I do
Now,
think that if there had been someone like a Jam on the jury as opposed to sitting next to Carolyn,
mhm,
there might have been more ability for people to see that about
right,
Carolyn because Jam was so aware of it. I think that that probably would have brought out a different side of her potentially because I think he would have been kind of pushing that narrative
right.
if he were on the jury.
Yeah, yeah. And Carson tried to, but I mean,
He did.
he was stage momming her, um,
Which
but
was amazing.
yes, yes. Um, uh, but he also, he had two dogs in this fight. So,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
um, now, once again, leaving the Tika 3, we see that Heidi understood this rule and took specific steps to address it. She told Dalton Ross, I know that my game wasn't flashy because I think in the new era of Survivor, the flashy players go home. I did not want to go home because I was in it to win it. So it was like, how do I play a strategic game and have shields in place that could protect me? And it actually worked for me. And she's right. By
Yeah.
having shields like Danny and Franny, people paid less attention to her and she
Mhm.
kept moving forward in the game all the way to final 3.
Right. Not so flashy, right?
Yes,
No
exactly.
big moves.
Yes. We said
Except
she's
one
a
that we'll
listener.
talk about.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um, in just a couple minutes. Now, that takes
Mhm.
us to Lauren, who was portrayed as a threat if she'd made it to the end.
Yeah.
Carson said she played a game based on building bonds and had a lot of friends on the jury, which worried them. It's hard to say if they should have been worried or not, but I think it goes back to Carson believing he could beat the other two Tika. So why risk tribal allegiances coming into play? If you could get rid of
Yes.
her, that just gets rid of that whole problem.
Yeah, and I do think that this is worth noting because the amount of times we've heard Ratu strong, it
Mm-hmm.
was like a mantra that so many of them had. And so when you're looking at the makeup of the jury, you have to be mindful of that because
Right.
so many were wanting to go, stay Ratu till the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, she had a lot of friends on that jury. That is definitely threatening. And that
Right.
is definitely a concern because if you start counting votes, she's going to potentially have 3 votes right off the rip.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a hard thing to overcome. You don't want to be having to compete with someone who has those tribal bonds and those tribal alliances and then was Ratu strong and could sit there and say, I'm a Ratu, you were a Ratu. Look at us. Like I'm here.
I just
And
feel
this
there's a
was
song there. Wouldn't you like to be a Ratu too? Yeah.
So yeah, I do think that Lauren was definitely a threat for a final tribal council because of the amount of Ratu that are on the jury.
Mm-hmm.
But also there were a lot of people that talked about her just being, and unfortunately we didn't see a lot of this. I mean, she had won 2, it was 2 immunity
Two
challenges, right? So
immunities. Yeah.
she was doing very well in the challenges and she seemed to be doing very well just relationship wise. And so I do think that the commentary surrounding Lauren
Mm-hmm.
was that she was a threat. We just didn't see as much of it as we should have considering where she
Right.
ended up in the game.
Yeah. And some of this, there wasn't a whole lot she could do about. I mean, the rule is
Right.
don't be too much of a threat. How do you not be a threat? I mean, I guess what she could have done was to downplay the Ratu aspect of things. Like,
Yeah,
I
I
didn't
mean, and
really get
that's
along with them anyway.
right.
But having them in the jury, there was nothing she could do about that.
No, not nothing. No.
Right. All right. Well, we move to the 7th rule, which covers idols and advantages and game mechanics.
Mm.
And the first thing we should talk about here is Final Four fire making.
Ooh,
Now,
we're jumping right
yes,
into it. Okay.
yes.
All right.
People have heard us complain about it before. Yes, I'm
Yeah.
going to do it again.
Me too.
It's still terrible. Jeff is still using his propaganda to make it sound awesome.
Mm.
When Heidi chose Carson to face in fire making, Jeff talked about how people at home were going to be excited and grab the popcorn, and totally ignoring how we would have actually been excited to see how that vote would have transpired otherwise.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wanted to see what would happen if Tika had to turn on each other.
Yeah. Right.
And it really, I mean, you were talking about if they had voted out one of their own, they might have lost that vote on the jury and da da da.
Mm-hmm.
We never got to see that actual drama.
Yeah.
Like, what would happen amongst these people?
Right. And I think what's happening at this point is that instead of people celebrating the final immunity challenge like they used to because of the power that
Mhm.
came with it, now it doesn't even matter because now there's
Right.
still this other hurdle that has to be gotten over, and that's now fire making. So you've
Yeah.
taken the power that this person used to have, which if we jump back, and I'm going to go way back in time, super old school, when there was only 2 people in the finals
Mhm.
as opposed to 3, that decision could actually cost you the game because you were deciding
Yes.
who you were sitting next to. And we
Right.
can go back to Survivor Australia.
Woo.
Oh, well, and that as well. I
Yeah.
mean, when people were making the decision between this person or this person, and
Mhm.
it was weighing very heavily on them because this is $1 million decision, and we've seen it happen multiple times where they chose the wrong person and they end up losing the
Colby.
game. That's exactly who I'm talking about. The whole world was
I seem to
just
have this
shock
cough that
faced.
keeps just having
It
names
just
come
it
up. It's
keeps
really
coming.
weird. Yeah.
When he decided to get rid of Keith instead of
Mhm.
Tina, I think the whole world gasped, like, "What are you doing?" And
And
sure
some of us
enough,
put him into the reality TV Hall of Shame. Yes.
well, yeah. So this is why those final votes become so significant, and it
Yeah.
shouldn't be about fire making. It should be about the social capital that you've created and that
Mhm.
you've built, and
And how
and
it
having
impacts, how
yes, having to
how
backstab. Yes.
how, if the 3 Tika had to vote one of themselves out,
Yeah.
how would that have impacted the game?
Yes, and how would that have affect final tribal council
Right.
and and people being upset or
Yeah.
reacting to you backstabbing me or turning your back on me?
Mhm.
What you used to see was people fighting against each other in order to convince the person who had
Mhm.
immunity why they should stay in the game versus somebody else.
Right.
Now it's everyone goes and practices fire.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even matter that the person has a necklace around the neck because Jeff is telling them they should make fire too.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, people might say, "Well, this is the state of the game as it stands."
Sure.
And it is. But
Mhm.
and I think I speak for you too, I'm just so tired of Jeff pushing the idea that fire making is some sort of big move when it's not.
Mhm.
And most importantly, Jeff can push all he wants. Some jurors are starting to buy into it. And one reason I'm, the meme standing here yelling at clouds, is not so much for Heidi here, but for future Survivor players. We
Mhm.
don't want them buying what Jeff is selling.
Yeah.
Marianne did a great job on the know-it-alls talking about this, saying jurors should not throw out the first 24 days of actual gameplay because a
Right.
fire was made on the 25th day.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you,
Um,
Marianne. Yes.
yeah, and this is a winner from the new era.
Mhm.
Um, but okay, you
Deep
know where
breaths.
we stand. Now
Yes.
what? Now where do we go from here? Heidi was faced with a decision. As much as I'm against it, the thing that Heidi had to do was, as we talked about earlier, think about her own game.
Yeah.
And, while I could sit here and you could sit here and think about the game of Survivor overall, and, me and you saying, well, we don't like a jury rewarding fire making. Well, we're not actually in the running for the $1 million. It's
Mhm.
kind of like, going way back to the beginning of the game, Maddie, she didn't want to see Jamie targeted and end up, instead, she started a chain of events, resulted in herself getting voted out because
Right.
she was doing it in terms of wanting the game overall to go in a certain direction.
Mhm. Yeah.
But she also needed to look out for herself. And that's what Heidi was doing here. As she
Mhm.
said at one point, you have to do what's best with what you're given.
Yes.
And,
And
it
I don't
seemed
disagree
like,
with that at all.
yeah, it seemed like she knew she had to try to give herself a boost. And she hoped the jury would reward her, even if we don't want the jury to reward people for making fire.
Right. And I think that that's something that listeners and people need to understand about our complaints related to this.
Mm-hmm.
We don't like it because it has taken away a huge component of the game. And
Right.
that is the social capital that you have built that has gotten you to that point and how that final vote will affect things moving forward. So this is the issue that we have with it is that it takes away that whole
Mm-hmm.
part. And I think Marianne was spot on that you're discounting all of the game that you've played up until that point. But you have to play within the confines of which you are given. And this is what we've also talked about. This is the game that now exists. And unfortunately, now players have to consider this when they should never have to consider this.
Right.
This shouldn't be what needs to be considered, is whether or not you're going to make fire. Making fire on Survivor, yeah, you should know how to make fire. We should never have the matches seen ever again. You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sorry. I
Yeah, I mean, like,
heard a weird
that's
noise coming from some part of my house.
like that should never be a thing. Fire making used to be to break a tie. Like
Right.
that's when, fire making became a thing. So it was like, okay, now this is going to happen. Unfortunately, now it is a determining factor. And I think that we've seen it negatively affect too many people when it was introduced. And Chrissy,
Yep.
that moment for Chrissy, I think, is horrifying. I mean, she was killing the game. She had done everything she needed to do to get herself into a position to win that game because of the social capital she had built, because of the relationship she had created. And then all of a sudden, oh, by the way, we're going to throw this at you.
Right.
And take that completely away from you, because all of them in that final, and I know I'm jumping to a different season, but knew at this point, we can now vote out the person that we were the most worried about getting to the end. We can eliminate that threat for us all.
Right.
And now I can't. I don't have that ability anymore. And that, I think, is what's so frustrating about fire making, is that you are taking away the player's ability to just continue to play the game. And I don't appreciate that at all. So I can understand why Heidi thought she needed to do it, because of where she was in the game and her thinking that she needed to make this move in order to get the extra recognition from the jury. And it worked from one. Danny was like, that was great. And I'll give her props for that. But it changes the dynamics of what Survivor is. And that is what I just can't stand about it at all.
Yeah. I mean, Heidi's husband saw some of my anti-fire making tweets and responded and noted correctly that Heidi attempted the biggest calculated risk she had left to try to move some of the jury while still making it to the end. He also noted that she was aware that she was behind and was trying anything she could to influence the jury. All of those things are true.
Sure.
Even though I don't like the idea that the jury could potentially be influenced in that way.
Right. Right. It needs to be a continuation of your entire game the entire time, and can't come down to this one thing.
Well, it shouldn't, but the jury
It shouldn't. Right. It shouldn't. Right.
Now, with all of that said, I do think there are a couple things Heidi should have done a little bit differently. Recently, I've noticed a trend of players near the finale telling the jury what they're going to do to get the jury's votes.
Yeah.
To me, this is too much honesty. And it's not just Heidi. It was something, I've noticed it, and Heidi doing it was finally what got me to say, wait a minute here, this has gone too far. But, she basically was telling them, I'm doing this to get your votes.
Yes.
And I feel like telling the jury you're making a move to get the jury's votes blunts the effects of what you're doing. It's like a magician saying, now I'm going to pull this rabbit out of where I've hidden it in my sleeve. Or going on a date and saying, I'm bringing you flowers in the hopes that it will make you think that I'm a caring person. And I'm taking you to a nice restaurant and paying in the hopes that it will make you want to go out with me again. It's too much honesty.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's something I've noticed over the several recent seasons, not just with Heidi.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I do think that it's kind of overkill a little bit in what they want the jury to utilize in their decision making.
Right.
And that really needs to come down to the final tribal. I mean, like there is a way to use the jury to your benefit and to plant seeds with the jury. But yes, sometimes it's like
they
too
should
much.
Be seeds. They shouldn't be like whole
exactly.
plant.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
And I think another thing about the way the move was described also served to blunt the effect. If you are fully honest, as Heidi pretty much was, you're telling the jury that you're making this move because you don't think they'll vote for you otherwise.
Right.
And this would seem to pull the chair out from under you for arguing later in final tribal council, unless you specifically remember to come back to it and say, well, I didn't think you would vote for me for these reasons, and here's why that's not true.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe she did that and we didn't see it. I don't know. But I still don't think that's something you should say. I think that instead she should have simply said, I think Carson is the biggest threat. I know I have to get rid of him. I am the only one who currently has the power to do that. I
Mm-hmm.
am confident in my own abilities. So I'm going to take matters into my own hands and eliminate him.
Yes, and that is going to make you look so much better in front of the jury because it's
Mm-hmm.
not going to be, I haven't done enough up to this point
Right.
to win, so I need this one more thing. Instead, it's, I have done a whole bunch of stuff and I put myself here, which she said very
Mm-hmm.
vehemently in all of her
Yes.
exit interviews. Like, I made this, I got
Right.
here because of me, which, yeah, props to her, she did. So presenting it in the way of, I'm now going to take out the most threatening player in the
Right.
game, the one that's most likely to win.
Mm-hmm.
And I want the credit for that. And I'm going to do it myself. But again, that could have happened if they were allowed to vote, right? And
Right.
this is,
I'm just saying what Heidi could have done in this
oh,
situation. And
100%. Yes. But
she did mention some of this, but it was, from what we saw, it was kind of buried in so much of the other stuff. I
yeah.
think it should have just been direct statement. I am
Sure.
doing this and here's why I should get the credit for it.
Yeah. And that I think is going to then not put yourself in a situation where you've essentially told the jury, I can't win unless I do this. If
Right.
I do this, then you can consider it. If I don't do this, then I shouldn't win the game.
Right.
It does represent it as if I am taking the entire game into my own hands and I want all of the credit for this.
Yeah.
Therefore, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was a fair amount of time spent on fire making. Who would have thought it? But at least some of it is as much for future players who might be listening as us trying to counter the propaganda as it was a
Mm-hmm.
review of what Heidi did. So to continue with Heidi for other aspects of this rule, I want to go back to her saying in the pregame that in the last few seasons, everyone shared every time they found an advantage or idol, and it
Yes.
bit them.
Mm-hmm.
So when
Yeah.
she found her idol, I was very happy to see that she held fast to her plan and did not
Mm-hmm.
tell a soul.
Yeah, that was
And
great.
in her interview with Rob, she verified what I had said last week about how if she had played her idol differently to force one of the Tika out, she would have just been voted out next anyway at Final Five.
Yeah, and I do think that it was a permutation we kind of worked through. Like,
Yes.
could she have done it a little bit differently? But yeah, I do think that just knowing what the numbers were and what the options would have been, it wouldn't have benefited her the way that we kind of. I mean, it would have been fun to watch, but then yes, you're basically signing your own like self out.
Yes.
You might as well write your name on your own parchment at that
Right.
point.
Right. Now, in addition to her idol, Heidi, of course, also found the control vote advantage. And as the engineer that she is, she did the math to realize that there was no way she could do what people wanted her to do in terms of saving Matt. I, went through and surmised that on the podcast at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, when she was talking to Rob, she again verified what I had said about knowing Lauren could use the extra vote to tie things up, etc. She also explained that she used the advantage primarily to avoid making enemies and to have more potential allies and gain information. It wasn't the outcome of the advantage that mattered. It was how she used it, what she gained by using it.
Yes, and I do think it's worth noting as well because we tend to complain about things that are put into the game.
Us?
Is that she even acknowledged she wasn't sure if she had to use it. Like,
Right.
nobody really explained to her whether or not she had a
Yeah.
choice, which I think lends some truth to our concern that maybe there's too many rules associated with these trinkets and things that are being introduced to the game. If the player doesn't even fully comprehend
Right.
themselves what they kind of can't do and has to go back and check with production to
Yeah.
see if, am I even required to do this? Like, do I
Right.
have to do it? But I can give her props, obviously, for the use of it because
Right.
she wanted to not burn any bridges in the process of doing it. So I think her determination as to how to use this was great, but also the fact that there was some confusion. Interesting. Just
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving to Jam Jam, he didn't specifically get anything himself. And apparently his lie detecting skills didn't quite work on Carolyn for the idol she had, though he said in interviews that he thought she might have had it. But the thing is that because he knew about all those things floating around in the game,
Hmm.
he was able to work around them and not get caught off guard by them.
Yes. Yeah. He just had his finger on the pulse everywhere.
Right. We just mentioned Carolyn's idol, and of course, she also did the right thing in keeping it a total secret, which I
Hmm.
think nobody expected from her. She went
Right.
even further by putting, the red X in the bird cage and using it to mark where she planted her fake idol,
Hmm.
which, she tried to downplay as silly. But I think it was really smart thinking.
It
In
really
fact,
was.
it was such smart thinking that Australian Survivor did essentially the same thing last season, but Carolyn did it better.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was Carolyn actually did it because she needed to fix what she thought was a
Right.
screw up too, which I thought was great that she was thinking all the way through like, "Oh my god, I didn't close the bag. This is going to be bad. What do I do? How do I fix this?"
The bag.
And then
The bag.
hmm,
The bag.
the bag. But so she was able to come up with this plan that she also thought
Mhm.
was silly, but it ended up working great, and I think it worked great because of all of the stuff that CBS keeps
Right.
doing with Survivor, throwing in all of these weird things that I think that everyone looked at it and went, "Oh, something else is now being done." Where
Well, Jeff
there's
even
this
said that. He's like, "Well,
yeah.
it's great because, yeah, we could have thrown that in there." It's like, "Yes, Jeff, you could have,
Yes, you
that's
could have
not."
because that's what you do. You
Yeah.
throw too many things in
It's like
there.
you're acting like that's a compliment, and it's not, Jeff. Um,
Yeah.
so,
Mhm.
um, but again, that's someone, even though we don't like the fact that those things could have been in there, it's someone working with the fact that it could have.
Right. Yes. She's working again within the confines of which
Right.
Survivor now exists.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, Lauren also got an advantage, the bank vote, but she didn't exactly keep it a secret or
Right.
like keep it a secret at all. Everybody knew she had it, which pretty much made it worthless. I think I said
Mhm.
earlier this season, and I certainly had debates about it with some people online, that a known extra vote advantage can easily be worked around as just another number and is not really worth anything at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there were some discussions about this too with Rob about
I don't remember.
yeah, but
But
anyway,
yeah,
again, it's
yeah,
too many rules that
yeah.
are being implemented.
Yeah. Now, what's more amusing is how Lauren ended up getting her advantage because she was the one who gathered the rocks to, sorry, do a rock draw,
It's
and she
okay.
knew which was which. And so then she picked the right one. Now, Matthew later told Gordon Holmes that the whole tribe saw what she did and knew she was sneaky. And Kane added to Mike Bloom that Lauren had lied about the rock bag thing and was a little shady. He
Yeah.
said she wasn't exactly too graceful putting a giant gray rock in the bag and picking it first. But it never came back to bite her, and it's still an amusing story. Future players, take note and be a little sneakier.
Well, and you know what? Future players, I don't know, touch all of the rocks in the bag. Maybe they feel different. To this day, I
Yeah.
don't know because I picked the first one I touched.
Well, so did, but she picked first, she said. So
No, no,
none of
I'm
the
just
others could
right.
even know
Right.
if they
But I'm
did.
just saying, so if you are in a rock draw that you
Mm,
haven't put the rocks in the bag yourself and are very
yeah.
familiar with which one is the gray rock because you picked
Yeah.
it and put it in the bag, just touch them all. Touch
Yes.
them all.
Touch all the rocks.
Just in case
What
one
didn't,
feels
was that,
different.
what, isn't that what Carolyn's intro was? Was I want to touch all the rocks and rub them over
Yes,
me?
and she was
Yeah.
rubbing them on her as she said
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
do that. Touch
There you
all
go.
of the rocks.
Rub all the rocks on you. Um, I could just imagine if there's an actual rock draw with Jeff and they're like, "Oh, I just want to feel them all." Um, all right, getting to
Boy.
Carson. I almost forgot that he briefly had an idol that he never had to worry about playing.
Oh,
Um,
that's right. Yes, because he
yeah,
was
see?
handed one from
Yes.
production.
Yeah, when he was swapped to Ratu, but they never went to tribal council before Mergatory.
Right, didn't
Uh,
matter.
However, he explained in his Dalton Ross interview that he thought things through logically and he knew the Ratu players would expect him to have something. So he
Mhm.
couldn't just lie and pretend to have nothing. So he made up the shot in the light advantage.
I love that he
Yes.
came up with this.
Yes, which turned the shot in the dark into a 50-50 coin, but without a vote.
Yeah.
And he felt that 50% perception of safety would allow him time to get in with the Ratu players, and it seemingly worked. Then later, he told Lauren and Kane separately that it was actually an idol, which gained further trust with them.
Right. Yeah. Now, the shot in the light, I'm like, that's genius.
I could
And
just
you
see
know what,
Jeff
again?
taking notes,
Right.
shot in the
This
light.
and this is the problem, is because this could exist. And this is
Right.
why, like, I can appreciate the fact that players are now very mindful of all of the weird things that
Mm-hmm.
could be played or could come up. And so now they're having to be that creative in their responses to various things. But
Yeah.
yes, CBS has made it
Not
difficult.
CBS, Jeff Probst. I don't think
Jeff
CBS
Probst.
is, really has that much of an impact on it.
I mean, when you're just handing people idols like that,
Yeah.
yeah, that puts them
Yeah.
in a tough spot, because then they got
Yeah.
to come up with something new,
Right.
like this shot in the light.
Yes. Now, there's one more thing we need to discuss about Carson in this rule, and that, of course, is his puzzle printing.
Yes.
I mentioned earlier that, until recently, that was my top TikTok, was what we had talked about. And, we saw that work out for Carson several times over. As he mentioned in interviews, because of all the practice, even if he had been facing a puzzle that he hadn't seen before, he just felt so confident that he could overcome it. And I noticed whenever he got to a puzzle, he kind of went into almost this Zen calm. Like most people, when they're with puzzles, they're like, oh, I got to put this piece here and this piece here and this piece here. And he would just be like, looking at the puzzle, look at the piece, take the piece, put it in.
That's because he had it memorized.
I know, but even without that, I feel like I don't know if he had the last puzzle memorized. It wouldn't surprise me if he did, but yeah, there was this calm about it.
Yeah, and he did do that last puzzle in a very methodical way. Like, he had
Right.
a stack of
Yeah.
pieces. It was like he was purposefully taking out all of the outside pieces
Right.
and putting them in the stack first. So he was very methodical about how he went about solving them, whether it was because he memorized it or just because he's really super smart. But yes, he was clearly 3D printing everything in his house.
And the thing is, if it was a flat puzzle, doing the outside first is absolutely the way you would do a puzzle like that.
Right.
But
Yeah.
most people try to build it up for stability. And he was having some stability issues, but
Right.
he got through them way faster than anyone else.
Yeah,
You
he
know,
did.
and do some people see this situation as similar to what we talked about with fire earlier? Yeah. People don't like it. People get mad. But I don't feel nearly as strong about it because it doesn't change the whole fabric of the game.
No,
And
but I do think the repeat of the same puzzles over and over again
yes,
needs to stop.
yeah, I mean, he took advantage of a situation presented to him. Again, should they change up the puzzles? Yes. But again, not his fault that they haven't, and it was smart of him to practice.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Just like people are buying flints and practicing making fire.
Right. All right. So we can move to Appendix A, which is about the tribe keeping their end goals in mind when voting. And we talk about voting out the weak, then the strong, then the weak, then the strong. As with Jamie last week, Lauren was something of an unaligned straggler who had to go. She posed a risk, as we discussed, but she also just wasn't part of the core alliance.
Right.
So then once she was gone, again, we discussed how everyone seemed to agree that Carson was the strongest player left in terms of threat level. So it made sense to target him.
Right.
Basically, everyone in the final five did what they were supposed to under this appendix.
Yes, because I do think that if they had decided at this point that they were going to then target a Tika, I think that you are then shifting the power in the game that you fought so hard to keep all the way to the end. And now all of a sudden it's 2-2 instead of this 3-1, which we ended up going into in the final four.
Yeah. All right. So we can go into Appendix B. And of course, this is when Appendix B really shines because it deals with the jury phase of the game. Now, this involves both actions leading up to the final tribal council and, of course, what happened within it. As the players approached that point, they were all thinking about how best to proceed. We discussed how Lauren was seen as a threat because of her friends on the jury. We discussed how Carson was seen as a huge threat by everybody because the jury would potentially just hand him the check. And Both of them were sent off before either of those situations could happen. So that left Heidi, Jam Jam, and Carolyn, each of whom had to tell different stories and convince the jury of different things in order to win, even though it might seem like Jam Jam and Carolyn should have been somewhat similar. And that's, of course, because of something we've mentioned several times now, how Jam Jam was more the outer face while Carolyn was behind the curtain.
Mm-hmm.
The key was, as Jam Jam himself noted on the show, that what matters is not how the jury members, not how what he thought of himself, but how the jury members perceive things. I almost
Perception is reality, right?
Yes,
we say this
exactly.
all the time. Yeah.
And that worked out well for him because the very first question was from Kane asking what they thought the jury's perception of each of them was, and was it accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Jam Jam opened by making them laugh and then went into how he wasn't just following Carson's lead. So he got to knock down right off the bat, like, you may think that this of me, but I'm going to knock that down right off the bat.
Yeah.
I was working together with him. I wasn't following him.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when Heidi interrupted to try to counter him, but he shot her down, giving him another point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Carolyn said she knew she was underestimated the entire game, but she was playing into it. Again, that was perfect for her to say at that point.
Yep.
Now, as things continued, without going into every detail, Jam Jam did an excellent job of weaving his story. As he explained in his interviews, he talked the jury through everything he did, and he explained the purpose behind all of it.
Mm-hmm.
For example, he discussed how he voted people out if they voted for him, because he knew that meant they'd be comfortable doing it again, and he couldn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
That clearly worked because, not specifically that, but the whole narrative, because Franny and Kane noted in the reunion they voted for him because he gave a narrative of how he moved through the game, explained his moves, showed he had a lot of control at the time. And, Carson added in interviews that Jam Jam owned his game very well also.
Yeah, and I think that that's the key part of the way that he was able to differentiate himself so well. Even though that we were able to see the three Tikas playing a different game, the fact that they were able to hide the Tika 3 from everyone, I think caused the entire jury to question, well, what was your role in this? Because clearly there was a Tika 3 and we're just kind of figuring it out. So how do you differentiate yourself now from these other Tikas? And he really did a great job of not just discounting Carolyn and Carson. Like, he didn't minimize them. He spoke about how significant all of the Tika 3 were, but what his role was in that Tika 3 and how he utilized that in his own game, which he needed to do at that point, because it otherwise they would have been like, well, this is clearly you are all just following Carson because we viewed Carson as the most threatening and the one that would probably win. So he must have been pulling all of the strings and he must have been making all of the decisions. So yeah, I mean, his ability to shut that down immediately, as you said, was great and necessary in order for him to then build upon that as the final tribal council moved forward.
Yeah. And, then he also said he might not be the best in challenges, but he could talk and talk and talk and talk, which is what this game is actually about, not like fire making and stuff.
Thing?
Yeah. And, he was using his body language reading to determine how the jury was reacting, to guide himself. And this is something I've done. Like, when I would give presentations, I would pick people out in the audience to see, are they laughing at my jokes? Are they understanding what I'm saying? Or are they giving me confused looks?
Right.
And so, yeah, it's a good thing to do when you're presenting, especially in this case, because his presentation was a lot more important than mine.
Right. And this is something he'd been doing all game, though, too, is he would pay attention to people's expressions so he could have that lie detector ability. And so he was doing the same thing, sitting there, was trying to make sure they were engaging and listening to him. And so it was a continuation of what he had been doing. And now he was able to pull it into his final tribal council performance.
Right. Now, another thing Jam Jam did well was the way he interacted with Carolyn and Heidi. He noted in interviews he gave them space to answer. He supported Carolyn, but at the same time, he also rebutted what Heidi said a couple times. But he was nothing was ever done in a mean way. Like, he never said anything negative about Carolyn, for example.
Yeah, and I think that that's interesting that I'm just going to put this out there. I do kind of miss those final tribal councils where things got really ugly and heated, and the jury was really like saying some things that were not so nice about players, just because it makes it more feel like a fight. I didn't feel like this was necessarily a fight. It felt
Right.
very like kumbaya, where everyone was getting along and there was hand holding and supporting, but at the same time, in doing so, he was able to talk about his
Right.
game, but he did it in a way that was so unoffensive and so just like acknowledging how he needed Carolyn, but this is why his game was better than hers,
Right.
but not putting her down in the process, which is also a really incredible thing to be able to do, because you are not offending anyone. You're not making anyone feel less than. And if there's one thing that we've talked a lot about, is you don't want to make the jury feel like I'm better than you,
Right.
because they're the ones that are voting. So you
Mhm.
want to be able to differentiate yourself from them as well, but do it in a way that, like, yeah, I had to vote you out because you were a threat to me.
Right.
And so you're making them feel significant. And there's a reason why you're sitting over there. It's not because I'm better than you. It's because you were a threat to my game. And so I needed to vote you out. And so he did a very, very incredible job of making everybody feel good about everything that was happening. And so nobody felt like they had some personal vendetta against him at that point because of
Right.
something that he did to them. It was
Right.
a really interesting thing to watch, and he just did it
Well,
it
and
was
also
very
nobody
smooth.
could feel like he was bullying anyone.
Yeah,
Like he was,
right.
nobody could be like, "Oh, I'm upset that you treated her that way, so I'm not
Right,
gonna vote for you."
exactly. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to Carolyn in a minute, but you mentioned, telling someone on the jury, "You're there because of you were a threat to me." I think she did a very good job of that with Danny. Like when
Mm-hmm.
Danny was like, "Well, how was I a problem for you or whatever?" And she
Right.
explained it. And that was
Mm-hmm.
also when Carson was, you know, um, but yeah, that's exactly what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, like I said, I'll get to more Carolyn in a minute, but for Heidi, she came in with a lot to explain, and she tried. She noted that she had to keep adapting. She was often alone. She hit her highs and lows. Um, Several times she did try to assert that she had made a move or been in control, but as we mentioned, Jam Jam deflected it aside by saying, well, no, actually, Tika was in control at that point, and here's
Mm-hmm.
why, which
Right.
had to be really difficult for her. And I think you mentioned this earlier. There were just some things she didn't know about. She
Right.
probably thought
And
they were
she's
doing it for a certain reason.
Yes, and she's learning it in front of the jury, which I
Right.
think is
That's never
incredibly
good.
telling. Right, where all of a sudden she's like, "Oh." And so she's learning new information as she sits
Yeah.
there, which I think is not good for her in that
Right.
moment, obviously, because the jury is seeing that too. And they're seeing, oh,
Hmm.
she didn't even know that this was happening, which means he's got to be outplaying her in that
Right.
regard. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of the problem for Heidi was that it's always a balance on when to play hard. And we discuss this frequently.
Yeah.
She waited because she knew that being a threat too early gets you voted out.
Mm-hmm.
But for this particular season, she waited too long. And by the time she sprung into obvious action, it was too late.
Yeah.
She talked about finding the idol, being the last remaining Soka, etc. But it didn't show the control that the jury was looking for. As
Yeah.
Carson said in interviews, he needed her to explain how she made intentional moves, and he didn't feel that he got that from her.
Yeah, and I think it's a hard thing to overcome
Yes.
when you've got the Tika 3 who are
Right.
now like, here's the grand reveal of how they did everything that they did. Even though we were seeing it, not
Right.
everyone else was seeing it. And you now have one of the Tikas sitting on the jury as well. So I'm sure that
Hmm.
Carson is talking back at Ponderosa about things that have happened in the game
Oh,
as
yeah.
well. So you're certainly up against a very, very big hurdle to get over when now it's all about the Tika 3 and everything that they've done. And unfortunately, I think it was just too much for Heidi because it really did come down to who was controlling the game.
Yeah. Yeah. And finally, we have Carolyn. Now, she said on Jeff's podcast that she felt she fell flat at Final Tribal Council. I
Mm,
think she's being a little hard on herself there. And I think she phrased it better when she was talking to Rob, as she explained that you have to know your audience.
yeah.
And indeed, this appendix says sometimes it's obvious what you need to say, sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm.
This wanted strategy and control.
Yeah.
In retrospect, she realizes that speaking emotionally from the heart, crying, telling her story wasn't going to appeal to them.
Mm-hmm.
She added to Rob that she just wanted to get her words out and lost sight of where she was and what she was trying to accomplish, which took her off track.
Yeah.
But she understood and was trying to convey that there's a spectrum where you're either strategic or emotional, but she didn't want to be that. Basically, going back to what we discussed in a lot of the fourth rule. But I think there was too much emphasis on the emotional side when
Yeah.
the jurors came in wanting to hear about the strategic work she'd done.
Yeah.
As Jamie told Dalton Russ, they all just met her at the merge and they didn't see what she'd done at Tika.
Mm-hmm.
Carson noted to Dalton that Carolyn was awesome and talked about her personal jury. However, she didn't really elaborate on a lot of her strategy. And I think a lot of it comes down to nerves, which is understandable. She told Mike she was really scared and slowly fell apart. She wanted to stand up for herself more and get that fire back, not that fire making, but it fizzled a little bit and they got in her head.
And I do think that the final tribal council, if you have a story to tell, it can certainly be beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing with Carolyn was everyone knew her story because she had been so open about what she had been struggling with and getting to this point. So it was already appreciated, I think, by the jury because they knew that component of her. And what they didn't know about her is what you've mentioned is the strategic component. So she's got a great story and who she is as a person is incredibly impressive. But now you have to say, okay, and so this is me, who I am as a person. And now let me help you understand this game that I was playing and that it wasn't just all Jam Jam. I had a part in it too. And she really needed to differentiate herself from Jam Jam as he was doing so well, singling himself out from the Tika 3 and all of the things he was controlling. That's really what she needed to step up and do as well. But yes, I mean, I do think that someone like Carolyn who acknowledges that she is an emotional person, she did become emotional. And so I think it was a hard thing for her to then keep in check and then really remind herself like what I need them to understand. So yeah, knowing your audience is key. And they already knew certain things about her. She needed to develop all of the things that they did not.
Right. And we saw some signs of it. Like when she talked about how sometimes she knew people expected her to cry. So she cried to use it for strategic reasons. But that was kind of mixed in with all the actual emotional stuff. And it was hard to suss out. Now, one thing I want to note that, she did well was when she was talking about playing her idol, Jam Jam tried to take it away from her a little bit by saying she didn't need to do it and he knew the votes were fine. And she did a good job of countering that by saying, well, I trusted you, but I didn't trust them, Jamie and Lauren.
Right.
It wasn't good enough, but it was a good counterpunch there.
Yeah. You definitely need to be able to defend yourself when someone is saying something to the jury that misrepresents what you actually did. And that's what Jam Jam was doing so impeccably well. He was getting in those moments where when Heidi was trying to downplay something that they had done, nope, let me correct you there. And then he was attempting to do the same thing with Carolyn, and she was able to at least do it in that one situation.
Right. Now, a lot of people thought the vote would be really close between Jam Jam and Carolyn, at least, but all the votes except Danny's landed on Jam Jam. It seems somewhat surprising in some ways, but even if everyone on the jury thought Jam Jam did just a little better than Carolyn, then it makes sense that each would individually vote for him. It's not a system where you can assign percentages. I think I saw or heard this on a podcast. If everyone thinks it was a 55-45 situation, well, they're going to vote with the 55.
Right.
They don't know necessarily how everyone else is voting. And so, each individual person, it's kind of like the Electoral College. It doesn't count the percentages of what was done in each state. It's that each state gets all those, the whole chunk. Each person got one vote,
Right. And I think, too, that we've talked a lot about how in that final tribal, it can come down to who do you like more because you want to vote for someone that you like. And I think the circumstances here was between Carolyn and Jam Jam, you had two people that were very likable,
Right.
and two people that had formed close relationships with most of the people sitting on the jury, so much so that they were able to utilize that in their strategy of the game
Mm-hmm.
because of those relationships they built. So again, you have two people who are both likable and who
Right.
are both doing things in the game relative to that strategic component for those relationships. But Jam Jam was able to then say, okay, I know y'all like me, but now let me step it up a level and tell you how I did in the game. Whereas Carolyn was, everybody likes me, but she didn't step it up as much as she needed
Right.
to get them to understand that strategic component as well.
Right. And that's someplace that I have bickered with Steven on. And I told him I was going to rake him over the coals about it, but I decided to go easy on the guy. But since you brought it up, yeah, I mean, he likes to assert they just vote for who they like more. But we saw here, they were talking about the strategy. They wanted to
Yeah.
hear the strategy.
Yeah.
They gave the reasons as the strategy.
Mm-hmm.
There were, multiple likable people here.
Yeah.
And this whole cast likes each other.
Yeah.
And so, it's about what they did in the game. We heard that, we saw that. And of course, you have to make moves to get to this point to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of
Yeah.
likable people never got to this point. So you can't
Yeah.
go in and just say, I'm going to be the most likable.
Right. Right.
You gotta, yeah, arms flying everywhere. So yeah, and this, like you said, they wanted to see the strategy.
Yeah.
And they got it.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, it is about time to wrap things up. What are your final thoughts on this epic dialogue that we've just had?
Well, listen, I'm sure that you have a very epic ending for this epic season. So I'm going to probably be a little more minimalized in mine because I'm always excited to hear what you've put together. But I will say, as far as the final five between Lauren, Heidi, Carson, Jam Jam, and Carolyn, I think we were blessed with an incredible final five. I know that some seasons we just don't feel this camaraderie and we don't feel this type of I don't know, this cast is just too nice. I mean, and I say that in like not a bad way, but like where's all the infighting and where's all the bickering? And we didn't see any of that. We saw a cast that was really focused on game mechanics and playing the game. And you've already mentioned that Jamie talked about how they could all sit around and they could meditate together and then still vote each other out. And so I can really appreciate that too, because this is something that we don't see very often. And so I think the final five was a great group of people. And it's nice to actually get to this point and be kind of scratching your head going, boy, anyone really could win. Anyone really could, depending on the configurations and who ends up in that final three. It really could be anyone's game. And so I appreciate each of them for the games that they played. I do wish that we had seen more of Lauren and Heidi's components that we missed out on, because that's just unfair to them and to us to really fully appreciate everything that they were able to accomplish. But what we did see was spectacular. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of the final five. The Tika 3, listen, you really were the narrative behind this season. Kudos and props to you for pulling it off, because my gosh, you started right from the beginning. Carolyn opened up the show and she basically ended the show. So thank you to each of you. Jam Jam, you are a fabulous winner, a great representation for everyone who wants to play Survivor, knowing that they can win. And I really am so thankful to have all five of these people part of the Survivor family, but also the entire cast as a Survivor family. So I will let you break it all down, put it together in your final words here. So thank you again to all of the five. It was a great season. Really enjoyable. Loved it. Thank you.
Yeah, we have come. I hope I don't get the hiccups again. For my
don't get the hiccups.
Like last time. We've come to the end of our long tail of five players. I'll start with Lauren, who we unfortunately knew the least about from what we saw on TV. I hope 90-minute episodes will be used to flesh out the stories of people like her and Jamie and Heidi going forward. But for now, we have what we have. Much like Jamie, she played a mostly Ratu strong game with some added flexibility, but not as much as should have been there. We had what or she had what she thought was a tight alliance with Carson and Jam Jam. But again, as we said last week, she was bamboozled because it was a backup and they tossed it aside when they no longer needed it. Especially when she was the last Ratu standing as they approached the possibility of her getting in front of the jury with so many friends there, which they felt they couldn't allow. Another person they, or more specifically Heidi, couldn't allow to get to the end was Carson. It seemed like literally everybody knew he was the biggest threat and would have likely won at the end. After Heidi won the immunity challenge, her best hope was to make a fiery splash and knock out the biggest threat. Carson did so much right through the game, but as he said on social media, 182 seconds was all it took to dismantle over 2 million seconds of social bonds, strategy, and intense physical exertion. I haven't double checked the math. I'll trust him on that. But he wasn't being salty about it. But as you might guess from the amount of time we discussed fire making, I kind of am, because I wanted to see what would have happened in a fire-free world. Nevertheless, he played an amazing game with so much strategy and control, but he just couldn't hide it any longer. He said in the pregame he wanted to be on Survivor so he could win the game he knows and loves and also prove that age does not define success. He wasn't able to do the first, but he certainly did the second. Carolyn said in the pregame, I know people are going to perceive me as that loud person that's out first or something, and it's not happening. I said in our pregame podcast that I believed her and didn't think she'd be first out of her tribe. And in fact, she wasn't voted out at all, ever. She became one of the superstars of this season, with many people who didn't know what to make of her in the beginning being converted to fans by the end. Her amazing personality also served her well in the game. She was her authentic self, letting her emotions out, but at the same time, not letting those emotions dictate how she played the game and using her personality to hide a strategic mind. The part she played in that strategy was to stay mostly hidden from a number of other players, such that being estimated could be a curse as well as a blessing. She started coming out from behind the curtain at about the right time, but she was up against her ally who played a similar game, but who'd been out front. And she also just wasn't able to pull it all together into an explanation the jury could hold on to. Heidi similarly stayed low on the radar, even though it was a different way. And then she came out and struck at the end, even, as we mentioned, knocking out the biggest threat. We frequently say that you can't win if you don't get to the end. Heidi made it to the final three. And I think in some seasons, she would have had a much better chance to win from there. But she was playing against an alliance of three wily strategists who also had brilliant social games. She was able to take out probably the most threatening, but that still left two more. One of them was, of course, Jam Jam. He worked with Carson and Carolyn to direct the flow of the game. As I mentioned earlier, Jam Jam correctly said in the finale that the key to Survivor is know what's going on and be aware what's happening behind the scenes. He came into the merge as a potential target, but used his position and that of the other two Tika to make allies, gain information, and always know what was happening. He gave himself options by making close relationships with players in different groups. And most importantly, he used his personality and humor to his great advantage. As he told Jeff on his podcast, he and Carolyn were having fun with the others, and those others thought they were just there for that fun. But whoops, they were there to play too. Everybody enjoyed Jam Jam. But just being well-liked isn't enough. He needed to use strategy to get to that point. And frankly, used strategy to become so well-liked by the right people. Then when it came to the final tribal council, he gave the jury what they were looking for, a narrative of how he made decisions and had control. I started off my first rule by quoting Jam Jam saying, "My words are my weapons." He used those weapons to diffuse situations, make people laugh, and most importantly, to distract or turn people against each other and make them do what he wanted them to do. Then he finished off with those words by telling the jury exactly what they wanted to hear. And that is why Jam Jam won and Heidi, Carolyn, Carson, and Lauren lost.
Fabulous as always.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Love it.
All
and
right.
You know what?
What?
We don't have to do predictions.
I know, but we do have to do a couple other things before we wrap up. So people should not turn
we
it off
don't
yet.
have to do predictions.
I don't know. I kind of like predictions for some reason.
Yeah, I guess you would.
I remember why.
Again, I'm wearing it for you. So
yeah, I
you're
know.
good.
Still,
You got credit the entire time.
Yeah, I know. I like it. But let me remind everyone, not of that part, but that the rules we just discussed are, of course, available in poster form at
Yes, they are.
robhasawebsite.com/yxlostfeed. You can get the poster to hang up, you can get the poster to wear on a shirt, or you can get the checklist, and you can even wear it forwards instead of backwards if you want. Hey,
Right.
you live your life the way you want to live your life.
Exactly.
Be flexible.
That's right. Be flexible. Wear your shirts backwards. It's fine.
Yeah. And, I think, at least 3 of the final 4 players listen to this podcast. And, we know one of them lives by the rules. So
one of them has a
get the
poster.
So at least one of them.
At least one of them. Yeah, I need to. I've mentioned this. I have to start keeping track of names of people that order the posters. So yes, you definitely should order the poster.
People are going to start ordering John Smith.
I know they don't want anyone to know. Can we tell people how to find us?
Mm-hmm.
So you should definitely follow us on Twitter. I am at Jessica Lewis 89. And David Bloomberg is not just at David Bloomberg for his Twitter, but he is a social media guru, I would call him, because he has the linked tree that allows you to, I'm sorry, what?
Link tree. No ED.
Link tree that allows you to find all of the ways that you can follow David Bloomberg, which he has now put up on the screen for those watching, for those just listening. David, tell them all of the ways that they can follow you.
I feel like a game show. David, tell them what they've won.
Exactly.
Well, you can find out by going to Linktree/David Bloomberg with a dot before the EE. And you'll get a free set of steak. No, you will not get a free set of steak.
Be careful. You're making promises here.
Yeah. But yes, you can get to all my different accounts, social media accounts that way, as well as some other important links. Like you can go to the poster that way too. So yeah, Linktree/David Bloomberg with a dot before the EE. Also on all the video locations, as I mentioned before, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, I'm David Bloomberg TV.
Beautiful.
I also want to encourage people to check out the RHAP patron program at robhasawebsite.com/patron. And, that way you can get all access to all the special podcasts, the Facebook groups, Discord, and you support shows like ours and everything on the network. So again, robhasawebsite.com/patron, or just click on the link in our YX Lost feed page. Also, even though we're at the end of the Survivor season, there will be more things happening, and you should make sure that you get those more things by subscribing to all the reality TV RHAP-Ups podcasts by going to robhasawebsite.com/RHAP-Ups feed, select your podcast service of choice, and you'll get, like I said, not just all the different Survivor shows that are done, by the people like us and Taryn and Mike and Liana and Shannon, but just number of different podcasts on all sorts of things. So, definitely subscribe to that feed.
You definitely should. And I would like to thank everyone who works there, as will David. We want to thank everyone, Scott and Jill and Derek, for all of the editing that you do, not only on the Why Blank Lost podcast, but also all of the content that you just heard David speak of on the RHAP webpage. Thank you for all of the incredible work that you do. There is so much content, and it really is amazing to see how much is put out there. So you certainly should subscribe, and then you should certainly become a member, because it's just really great to see how much work everyone is putting into it. Thank you to Chelsea for all the posts that you put out regarding, again, not just Why Blank Lost, but all of the RHAP content. Thank you for Tricky for the beautiful artwork that, if you are watching, that you get to see. Thank you for that. And thank you to Will from America for the theme song, which I don't think you get with the YouTube, but you get it with just
find a way for Well, go ahead, and I'll tell them when I'm going to find the
Yes.
way.
So you can hear it if you just listen to the podcast, but if you're watching on YouTube, you don't hear it. But it's a great song. So it's very catchy. You should definitely check it out. So thank you for that. And what did you want to add to that, David Bloomberg?
Well, I want to thank you for another great week and just a great season as a whole. I mean, it was, it was a lot of fun as always, getting to, get together and talk to you once a week here.
Listen, it has been so much fun that I'm going to reshake my,
Uh-oh.
I'm going to do more. You ready? It's going to be like,
See,
yeah.
this is what people didn't get to see was you shaking, the cans beforehand too. So
Yeah, so thank you, David Bloomberg, for allowing me to be part of this. Has been truly awesome. It has been great to be we're asked to do this over and over again. So thank you, and thank you to all the listeners who continue to come back and to comment and just respond to the things that we are putting out there. We appreciate you very much. So yeah, I can't believe another season has come to an end.
I
But
know.
that
It does.
doesn't mean they
Yeah.
don't get to see us again, right, David Bloomberg?
That is true because, as I mentioned earlier, in relatively few days, we will be back here with Tiffany Seeley and Dr. David Voce. I am going to find a way, I hope, to get the theme song for those of you who have been doing it. Maybe we'll do a sing along.
There we go.
But yeah. So again, send in your questions and we will see you then. We'll cover the whole season and whatever else we want to talk about. Maybe we'll catch up on Tiffany and Voce, and I'm sure we'll hear some Carolyn stories and who knows what else.
Right.
Tiffany was at the finale party, the Bryson Wen finale party. So who knows what'll happen with those two, who knows what'll happen. Anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, and maybe we'll get videos of Jessica cleaning her ceiling.
There's a whole lot up there.
So with that, I just want to say again, Jessica, you talked about all the content that's out there on RHAP. There's even content elsewhere. We don't need to talk about that. But so thank you, listeners, viewers, for spending your time with us. We appreciate it. And
we do.
We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.